Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we are settling in with something so familiar, so constant and so easy to overlook that most of us hardly stop to think about it at all. Hearing. Not just the fact that you can hear, but how you actually hear. How a voice crosses a room and somehow becomes meaning in your mind. How music arrives as nothing more than moving air and yet can feel rich, heavy, bright, distant, sharp, warm, or strangely tied to an old memory you did not expect to revisit tonight. It is a quiet little miracle, really. A soft, mechanical story hidden inside the side of your head. A story of folds, tunnels, membranes, bones smaller than grains of rice, fluid, nerves, and signals travelling so quickly and so faithfully that the whole thing feels effortless, as if sound simply appears inside you like magic. But it is not magic. It is anatomy. Very delicate anatomy. Very clever anatomy. And at times rather odd anatomy too. After all, if someone calmly told you that your ability to hear depends on a tiny drum, being struck by invisible waves and a set of miniature bones passing those movements inward like careful messengers, you might reasonably suspect they were describing a pocket-sized concert hall built by an eccentric engineer. Before we drift into that hidden architecture, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what the world sounds like around you right now. Maybe the room is quiet except for the faint hum of a fan or the low whisper of traffic beyond a window. Maybe there is rain tapping the glass in the patient way rain often does. Maybe you are under blankets, listening through headphones, with the rest of the house finally still. Whatever your corner of the world sounds like at this moment, it is part of the very story we're about to follow. And if you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a nice way to wind down at the end of a long day, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this calm little place reach more people who might want something gentle to listen to before sleep. Now then, get comfortable, let your thoughts loosen a little, and we will begin with a simple truth that turns out not to be simple at all. The world is full of motion, and some of that motion becomes sound. Hearing is one of those abilities that seems direct until you look closely. You hear a door close, you hear someone call your name, you hear water boiling, a dog barking, a train in the distance, a spoon touching a mug. It feels immediate, the sound is there, and then it is in you. Yet between those 2 points lies a chain of events so precise and so layered that it deserves a little patience. Sound does not begin inside the ear, it begins outside you, in movement. Something shifts, strikes, scrapes, vibrates, or bursts. A guitar string is plucked. Vocal cords flutter in the throat. A shoe meets the floor. A branch knocks against another branch in the wind. That movement pushes against nearby air molecules, and those molecules push against others, and soon a wave of pressure is travelling outward through the air in all directions. Not a solid object, not a little piece of sound flying through space, just a pattern of compression and release moving through a medium. This is one of the first strange things about hearing. Sound is not a substance you collect. It is a disturbance that travels. If the air could speak for itself, it might say that it is being politely jostled into passing along a message. One molecule nudges the next, and the next, and the next, until that moving pattern reaches your body. In space, where there is no air for the wave to move through, ordinary sound cannot travel at all. A dramatic explosion in a film may look thrilling in the vacuum beyond Earth, but in reality there would be silence. Quite a lot of science has had to forgive cinema for that one. Here on Earth, though, sound is everywhere because air is everywhere, and air is remarkably good at carrying these pressure changes. What we call pitch depends largely on how quickly those pressure waves repeat. A slow repetition gives you a lower sound. A faster repetition gives you a higher one. Loudness depends on the size of the pressure change. A larger vibration means a stronger wave and, generally speaking, a louder sound. timbre, that quality that makes a piano sound different from a violin even when they play the same note, depends on the exact shape and complexity of the vibration. Already, before sound has even entered the ear, the world is full of detail. The air's not just moving, it is carrying information. And still, information by itself is not enough. Your body has to catch it. More than that, it has to catch it efficiently. The head is not just sitting passively in the path of sound like a stone in a river. It is built with structures that help gather, direct and transform sound so the nervous system can make use of it. That begins with the outer ear, which many people think of only in cosmetic terms. We notice its size, its shape, perhaps whether it sticks out a bit more than someone would prefer in old-school photographs. But the visible ear is not ornamental. Its folds and curves help collect sound and guide it inward. It is a shaped surface with a job to do. That visible part, called the pinna or auricle, is made mostly of cartilage covered by skin. It looks simple until you really study it. Then it starts to resemble a carefully folded leaf, or a shell designed by a patient sculptor. Those ridges and hollows are not random. They help reflect and funnel sound waves toward the ear canal. They're especially useful for helping the brain judge where a sound is coming from. Because of its shape, the pinna changes sound slightly depending on whether that sound comes from in front of you, behind you, above you, or below you. The brain learns to use those small differences as clues. You do not usually notice this process happening. You simply turn toward a voice in the next room or look up when something thumps overhead. But those location clues begin with the way sound interacts with the outer shape of the ear. Humans are not the champions of ear design if judged by dramatic motion. A cat can swivel its ears with enviable precision. A rabbit looks permanently prepared to detect a leaf being insulted half a field away. We humans are much less theatrical about it. Our ears do not pivot like satellite dishes. Still, they do a clever enough job, especially in combination with the fact that we have two of them. That matters enormously. Hearing with two ears allows the brain to compare timing and intensity. If a sound arrives slightly earlier at one ear than the other, or slightly louder on one side than the other, the brain uses that difference to estimate direction. It does this so fast that it feels almost automatic, which of course it is. But automatic things are often the most astonishing once you slow down and notice them. From the pinna, sound travels into the ear canal, also called the external auditory canal. This is a narrow passage leading inward toward the eardrum. It is not merely a tunnel. It helps with protection, and it also shapes sound. The ear canal has a slight resonance, meaning it naturally boosts certain frequencies, especially those important for human speech. Quite convenient, really. Over time, natural selection seems to have had the good sense to favour anatomy that helps us hear one another. The canal is lined with skin, tiny hairs, and glands that produce earwax. Earwax, unfairly mocked in polite society, is actually useful. It traps dust, debris, and tiny intruders, keeps the skin from drying out, and helps protect against infection. It is not glamorous, but then many of the body's most loyal servants are not. At the end of the canal sits the eardrum, or tympanic membrane, a thin, delicate structure stretched across the boundary between the outer and middle ear. This is where the story becomes especially intimate. The pressure waves moving through the air reach the eardrum and cause it to vibrate. Air movement becomes membrane movement. It is a conversion point, a threshold. The world outside has been speaking in one language, and now the body begins translating. Every sound you hear, from thunder to whisper, must pass through this moment of physical response. The eardrum is thin, yes, but not flimsy in any careless sense. It is shaped and tensioned in a way that allows it to respond to a wide range of sounds. When pressure in the ear canal changes, the membrane moves back and forth. That movement may be tiny, almost unimaginably tiny, yet it is enough. Biology often works like that. It does not always need grand gestures. Sometimes the difference between silence and speech is a movement smaller than anything you could ever see with your own eyes. On the far side of the eardrum lies the middle ear, an air-filled space containing 3 tiny bones known collectively as the ossicles. Their names are wonderfully old and descriptive: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, hammer, anvil, and stirrup, the smallest bones in the human body and among the most hard-working. The malleus connects to the eardrum, the incus sits between, and the stapes presses against a small opening leading into the inner ear. When the eardrum vibrates, it moves the malleus, which moves the incus, which moves the stapes. One motion becomes another, passed inward through this miniature chain. These bones do more than simply relay movement, they amplify it. This is necessary because the sound has to move from air into the fluid-filled inner ear, and that transition is not easy. Sound travelling through air and sound travelling through liquid behave differently. Without some kind of boosting system, much of the energy would be lost. The middle ear solves this problem with elegant mechanical engineering. The arrangement of the eardrum and ossicles concentrates force so that the movement reaching the inner ear is strong enough to matter. It is rather like using the right tools to transfer a gentle tap into a more focused push. No fuss, no wasted motion, just careful leverage. Now one could live quite happily without ever imagining 3 tiny bones working in shifts inside the skull every time someone says good evening. But once that image arrives, it is difficult not to admire it. The middle ear is often described in dry textbook language, but really it is a hidden machine of impressive precision. It must be mobile enough to transmit delicate vibrations, stable enough to do so accurately, and protected enough to keep functioning over years and years of daily life. And daily life is not always considerate. Doors slam, cities roar, children discover metal objects and hard surfaces at the same time, yet most of the time, this system holds. The middle ear also contains 2 tiny muscles, and though we will spend more time with the details later, it is worth noticing them here, because they reveal something lovely about the body's habits. The ear is not just receiving sound, it is regulating it. These muscles can tighten in response to loud noise, reducing the transmission of vibration and helping protect the inner ear from damage. It is not perfect protection, and it is not fast enough for every sudden blast, but it is still a reminder that the body is not passive, it anticipates, it adjusts, it tries, within limits, to care for itself. Another part of the middle ear that deserves a small nod tonight is the eustachian tube, which connects the middle ear to the back of the throat. This helps equalize pressure on both sides of the eardrum. If you have ever been on an airplane or driven up a mountain and felt your ears pop, you have met this system in action. Pressure matters because the eardrum needs the right conditions to move freely. Too much difference between the outer side and inner side, and hearing becomes muffled, uncomfortable, strangely distant. A simple swallow or yawn often helps open the tube and restore balance. Again, such an ordinary feeling, such an ordinary little pop, and yet behind it is anatomy working quietly to keep sound clear. What is remarkable in all of this is that hearing begins as a physical event in the truest sense. Before it becomes language, before it becomes emotion, before a melody can ache or a laugh can comfort or a warning can startle, it is motion, pressure, vibration, displacement, tiny structures responding to tiny changes with extraordinary discipline. We often speak as though the senses are magical portals. In a way they are, but their magic is mechanical before it is mental, and that is where the story becomes even more interesting, because the ear does not merely transmit sound inward in the same form it arrived. It sends it toward a deeper structure where the message will be transformed again. Beyond the middle ear lies the inner ear, and there the architecture changes. No longer open air and little bones, but fluid-filled chambers and one of the most beautifully specialized organs in the body. A curled structure shaped like a snail shell, called the cochlea. If the outer ear is the collector and the middle ear is the messenger, the cochlea is where vibration begins to become nerve language. It is where the body starts turning motion into electricity. This is such a strange sentence that it is worth saying slowly in the mind. Sound does not remain sound all the way through. At a certain point it becomes signal. The ear captures a pressure wave from the world, passes its movements inward, and eventually creates patterns of neural activity the brain can understand. That is what hearing really is. Not just receiving sound, but converting it. Translation after translation. Air to membrane, membrane to bone, bone to fluid movement to cellular response to electrical impulse. All so that somewhere farther along, the brain may say, "That is a bird, that is a violin, that is my name." It is easy to forget how much interpretation is involved. The sound reaching your ears is not labelled. It does not arrive with neat little tags announcing itself as rain, applause, kettle, footsteps, memory. The world vibrates. Your body sorts it out. Even now, perhaps while listening to this, your ears and brain are filtering background noise, adjusting to volume, identifying tone, and deciding which sounds matter and which can fade into the edges of awareness. You are not hearing everything equally. You are hearing selectively. That too is part of the design. The opening of this story then is not only about anatomy in the narrow sense of parts and names, it is about what kind of problem hearing solves. The world is full of invisible movement. How does a living body turn that movement into useful knowledge? How does it detect a direction, separate one voice from another, notice danger, enjoy rhythm, learn language, remember a song, or feel soothed by a familiar sound in the dark? The ear is the first doorway in that process, but even at the doorway, there is already an astonishing amount happening. Perhaps the most comforting thing about it is how constant it is. You do not have to ask the ear to begin. You do not consciously instruct the eardrum to move or the ossicles to pass the message onward. You do not manually calibrate pressure on both sides of the membrane or command the pinner to gather sound. All of this unfolds on its own, minute after minute, year after year, while you go about the ordinary business of living. While you speak, while you listen, while you cross streets, while you half hear the kettle and fully hear the sentence that changes your day, the body keeps watch, and since tonight is only our gentle beginning, it is enough for now to rest with that image. Sound out in the room as moving air, the visible ear receiving it, the canal guiding it, the eardrum trembling with exquisite sensitivity, the tiny bones of the middle ear taking up the work and carrying it inward with more strength than their size would ever suggest. Quiet structures, deeply practical, doing the first part of a job so well that most of us never notice them until something feels blocked, dulled, or gone. In a moment, we will move closer to sound itself before it even reaches the ear, and then inward again toward the structures that begin sorting pitch from noise, signal from clutter, and vibration from meaning. Because the journey is only just beginning, and the next step lies in understanding exactly what sound is before the ear ever catches it. Before sound becomes hearing, it has to exist out in the world on its own. That may seem obvious at first, but it is worth slowing down over because sound is one of those things that can feel almost ghostly until you pin it down. You cannot hold it in your hand. You cannot see it crossing a room. It leaves no visible trail through the air, no tiny ribbon floating toward your head. And yet it is completely physical, firmly, stubbornly physical. Sound begins not as a feeling, not as music, not as speech, and certainly not as meaning. It begins as movement. Something vibrates. That is the first step. A throat hums, a glass is tapped with a spoon, a piano string is struck, a door shuts, a shoe brushes across the floor, a leaf rattles on a branch. Even something as soft as a whisper starts with motion, in that case breath shaped by the tongue, lips, teeth, and vocal cords. Once an object vibrates, it disturbs the material around it. In most of the situations that fill an ordinary human life, that material is air. The vibrating object pushes air molecules slightly closer together, then lets them spread apart again, then pushes again, and again, and again. The result is a travelling pattern of pressure. That travelling pattern is sound. This matters because sound is not an object moving from one place to another in the usual sense. The air itself does not make a grand journey across the room, carrying the sound on its back like a courier with a package. Instead, each little patch of air nudges the next patch, which nudges the next, and so on. A pressure wave passes through, while the molecules mostly jiggle in place. It is a little like the motion that moves through a crowd when people stand up one after another in a stadium wave. The crowd does not run around the stadium all at once. The pattern moves. Sound behaves in much the same way. The disturbance travels, even though the medium itself only shifts back and forth locally. Once you see sound this way, a great deal starts to make sense. A speaker on a table is not throwing chunks of music at you. Its surface is moving in and out rapidly, creating pressure waves in the air. A drum does not send tiny invisible pellets of noise into the room. Its stretched surface vibrates, and that vibration sets nearby air into a rhythmic pattern. Your own voice works the same way. Deep in the throat, your vocal folds open and close rapidly as air passes through them. That creates vibration, and then the mouth and nose shape the result into speech. It sounds intimate and expressive by the time it reaches another person, but at the beginning it is a mechanical event. There is something rather charming in that. A lullaby, a laugh, a confession, the rustle of pages, the first note of a favourite song, all of these begin as matter moving. The emotional weight comes later. The body and brain give sound its importance, but before that, sound is simply the world in motion. Because sound is a wave, it has properties that can be described quite precisely. One of the most important is frequency, which tells you how fast the vibration repeats. If something moves back and forth slowly, it creates fewer pressure cycles each second, and that produces a lower sound. If it vibrates more quickly, it creates more cycles each second, and the sound is higher. Frequency is measured in hertz, which simply means cycles per second. A low rumble might sit at a very low frequency. A whistle, a bird call, or a high violin note would be much higher. Human hearing, in ideal conditions and especially in youth, usually spans roughly from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. That sounds like a dramatic range because it is one. Even so, much of what matters most in speech sits in a smaller, more manageable portion of that range, which is fortunate because otherwise ordinary conversation would require the ears of a bat and the patience of a saint. Loudness, meanwhile, is tied to the size of the vibration. If the vibrating object moves a greater distance or with more force, it creates larger pressure differences in the air. Those stronger waves usually sound louder. A softly plucked string creates a modest disturbance. Strike it much harder, and the wave grows larger. The basic pattern may still be the same note, but now there is more energy in it. In the ear and brain, loudness becomes a rich experience with all sorts of nuances, but out in the world before any ear receives it, it is still a question of physical intensity. Then there is wavelength, which is closely tied to frequency. Low-frequency sounds tend to have long wavelengths, meaning the distance from one peak of the pressure wave to the next is greater. High-frequency sounds have shorter wavelengths. This is one reason deep sounds behave differently from sharp, high ones. Low sounds can bend around obstacles more easily and travel through walls more effectively, which is why a neighbour's bass line may arrive with unwanted confidence, even when the rest of the song has mercifully vanished. High frequencies are more easily blocked, scattered or absorbed. That is why muffled speech through a closed door often loses clarity first. The crisp edges of consonants do not travel as graciously as the lower, heavier parts of sound. Sound also needs a medium through which to travel. In air it moves well enough for daily life. In water it travels faster. In solids, faster still. This surprises some people because we often think of air as the natural home of sound. But that is mostly because air is the medium in which human hearing usually happens. From a purely physical standpoint, sound can move very efficiently through tightly packed material because the particles are close together and pass the disturbance along readily. It is why putting an ear to a door or even to train tracks, though not advisable for obvious reasons, can reveal vibrations that are difficult to hear through open air. The message gets through the structure more directly. This also explains one of the most famous facts about sound: it cannot travel through a vacuum. In outer space there may be light, radiation, motion and spectacular violence, but without particles close enough to pass along a pressure wave, ordinary sound has no medium. No air, no wave. Films tend to overlook this because silence is less cinematic than a roaring explosion, but physics is unmoved by dramatic preference. A star may erupt magnificently, and the universe itself may behave with terrifying energy, but in empty space the event would unfold without the kind of sound we know. Even here on Earth, the medium matters. Warm air carries sound a bit differently from cold air. Humidity changes its behaviour as well. Wind can subtly shape what reaches you and what does not. Large open spaces do not sound like small enclosed ones, because the environment affects how waves move, reflect, and fade. A clap in a cathedral lingers. A clap in a furnished bedroom dies quickly. A foggy field at night can make distant sounds seem oddly close, while a busy city street tangles wave upon wave until the whole scene becomes a thick acoustic stew. All of that happens before the ear has even entered the story. The world is already editing sound long before the body receives it. Reflection is a large part of that editing. When sound waves hit a surface, some of the energy may bounce back. That reflected sound can create echoes if the delay is long enough, or reverberation if many reflections overlap closely in time. A canyon throws your voice back to you with a satisfying pause. A tiled hallway gives footsteps a crisp, lingering quality. A theatre is designed carefully so that reflected sound supports speech and music instead of turning them into a blur. In fact, architecture and hearing have been close companions for centuries. Humans have been shaping spaces for sound almost as long as we have been shaping them for shelter. Even a small room tells you something with its acoustics. Walk into an empty apartment and it announces its barrenness immediately. Sit down in a room filled with rugs, curtains, books, and cushions, and the sound softens. The room begins to keep more to itself. Absorption is the other side of this. Soft materials tend to soak up sound energy more readily than hard surfaces, especially at certain frequencies. Thick curtains, carpets, upholstered furniture, and padded panels reduce reflections and shorten echoes. Hard walls, glass, stone, and bare floors reflect more. None of this changes what sound is at its core, but it changes the version of the wave that continues onward. By the time a voice reaches your ear, it may include the direct path from the speaker, reflections from the nearby walls, some frequencies slightly dampened by clothing or curtains, and others sharpened by the shape of the room. The ear will eventually sort through all that, but sound begins as a far less tidy event than we often imagine. Another important feature of sound is that waves interact with one another. When two waves meet, they do not politely stand aside. They combine. Sometimes this creates a larger wave, reinforcing the sound. Sometimes they partly cancel each other out. This is called interference, and it helps explain why sound in a room can seem oddly uneven. Move your head just a little, and a note may seem stronger or weaker. Stand in one part of a hall, and the bass swells. Take 3 steps, and it thins out. This is not the room playing games with you, though rooms sometimes seem to enjoy that reputation. It is waves overlapping, summing and subtracting in real space. Before hearing ever becomes a personal experience, sound is already engaged in this complex physical dance. Then there is resonance, which feels almost magical until one remembers that it is simply selective responsiveness. Every object has natural frequencies at which it prefers to vibrate. When an incoming sound matches one of those frequencies, the object may begin to vibrate more strongly. A tuning fork can set another tuning fork humming. A singer can, in very special circumstances, and usually with a remarkable note, make a glass vibrate dramatically. A guitar body resonates with the strings attached to it, amplifying the sound. Even the cavities in your own throat and mouth help resonate certain frequencies when you speak. Resonance is one of the reasons the world sounds as rich as it does. Materials do not just passively endure vibration, they answer it in their own way. This is also why different instruments sound different even when they play the same note. A clarinet and a flute may produce the same basic frequency, but the shape of the vibration is different because of the materials, resonances, and additional frequencies layered into the sound. These extra frequencies, often called overtones or harmonics, give sound its texture. The brain eventually experiences that as timbre, the distinct sound quality that lets you tell one voice from another or one instrument from its neighbour. But before any brain interprets it, timbre is born from the complex physical pattern of vibration itself. One source produces a relatively simple waveform, another produces something knottier and richer. Same note, different fingerprint. Human speech is especially remarkable in this way. The voice begins with vibrating vocal folds, but what we actually hear as words depends heavily on how the throat, tongue, mouth, and lips shape that raw sound. Vowels are produced by resonances in the vocal tract. Consonants often involve interruptions, bursts, friction, or brief closures. A spoken sentence may feel seamless, but physically it's a rapidly changing stream of shaped vibrations, one tiny act of acoustic sculpting after another. Long before another person understands what has been said, the air has already carried an intricate pattern full of information about pitch, rhythm, emotional tone, and even the size and shape of the speaker's vocal tract. Sound, in that sense, is never just sound. It is structure travelling. The natural world is full of examples of this. Thunder begins with a violent expansion of heated air after lightning. Wind in leaves depends on turbulent movement and repeated collisions. Ocean waves create sound through impacts, bubbles, spray, and rolling pressure changes. The hum of an electrical appliance comes from components vibrating at certain rates. The purr of a cat is a rhythmic biological mechanism. Crickets, birds, frogs, whales, insects, and humans all generate sound differently. But the principle underneath remains stubbornly familiar. Something moves. The medium carries the disturbance. A wave travels outward. Sometimes sound is below what humans can hear. Infrasound at frequencies below about 20 Hz may be produced by storms, earthquakes, volcanic activity, or large machinery. Humans may not hear it clearly as a tone, but it can sometimes be sensed as pressure, unease, or vibration. At the other end lies ultrasound, above roughly 20,000 Hz. Dogs hear some of it. Bats make brilliant use of it. Medical imaging borrows it for practical purposes of its own. Human hearing sits in between, useful for our way of life but far from complete. The world is making more sound than we know. Our ears, wonderful as they are selective translators, not universal receivers. This is worth remembering because hearing can feel like the whole acoustic picture when in fact it is only one slice. A dog whistle is a perfect little insult to human pride. There may be energetic sound in the room, fully real and physically present, and yet to us there is silence. The ear determines what part of the world's vibration becomes available to conscious experience. Before that, sound simply exists whether or not we can join the conversation. Speed is another piece of the puzzle. In air at room temperature, sound travels at roughly 343 meters per second. Fast, certainly, but nowhere near as fast as light. That is why you see lightning before you hear thunder if the storm is far enough away. It is also why large distant events can seem oddly out of sync at first glance. A hammer strikes steel on a construction site far away, and the visual action appears a moment before the sound arrives. The world is not misbehaving. It is merely waiting for the wave to complete its journey. Even close up, sound is a matter of tiny delays and subtle differences. That will matter very much once the ears enter the story in a more direct way. because two ears allow the brain to compare those differences with astonishing precision. But even before that, it helps to notice that sound is always travelling in time. It is not an instant copy of the world. It is a moving report. One of the loveliest features of sound is that it is both orderly and messy. The underlying physics is elegant enough to fit into equations. Frequency, wavelength, amplitude, resonance, reflection, interference, absorption, transmission. All perfectly describable. And yet the everyday experience created from these simple ingredients is endlessly varied. A room full of conversation, rain on windows, traffic at dusk, the small click of cooling pipes in a house after the heat goes off, footsteps in a corridor, a kettle starting to mutter before it boils. Every one of these is a blend of sources, surfaces, distances, and materials. The wave that finally arrives near your head is already a history of where it has been. That is why the first touch of hearing is not truly in the ear at all. It is in the world, in motion becoming vibration, in vibration becoming a travelling pressure pattern, in that pattern being shaped by distance, medium, temperature, surfaces, obstacles, and other waves. The ear does not invent sound. It receives a version of events that physics has already been busy composing, and still, none of this would matter to you in any human sense unless the body had some way of catching those waves and turning them into something useful. A pressure pattern in the air may be beautifully structured, but it is not yet hearing. It is only the possibility of hearing. The body must meet it halfway. It must gather the wave, guide it inward, and begin the long work of translation. That is where anatomy steps in properly, because once sound reaches the side of your head, it meets the first visible structure designed to collect the world and send it down a narrow path toward everything that follows, and that quiet, curved beginning is the outer ear. Most people think of the outer ear as the whole ear, which is understandable because it is the part you can actually see in the mirror. It sits there on either side of the head looking modestly decorative, occasionally causing trouble with cold wind, hats, or poorly designed earbuds, and generally receiving far less respect than it deserves. But the outer ear is not a spare flap of anatomy added as an afterthought. It is the opening move in hearing. Before sound can become vibration at the eardrum, before tiny bones can pass motion inward, before the cochlea can sort pitch from noise, the outer ear has to do something very important. It has to gather the world. That may sound a bit grand for a structure people mostly notice when choosing glasses, but the phrase is fair. The outer ear is the first meeting place between passing sound waves and the body's hearing apparatus. Out in the world, sound is spreading through the air in all directions, reflecting off walls, bending around furniture, slipping through doorways, and carrying with it all the richness and clutter of daily life. Voices overlap, traffic hums, floors creak, water runs, birds call, wind presses against leaves. Somewhere in all that motion is the sound that matters right now, and the outer ear begins the work of collecting it, shaping it, and sending it inward in a form the deeper parts of the system can use. The most visible part of the outer ear is the pinna, also called the auricle. This is the curved, cartilaginous structure attached to the side of the head. At first glance, it may look like a loose fold of skin and cartilage, with a rather eccentric design, as though nature had been given some spare material and decided to experiment with a series of ridges, hollows, and sweeping curves. But that peculiar shape is not random. The pinna helps catch sound waves and guide them toward the ear canal. Even more impressively, it helps modify sound in small ways that give the brain clues about where that sound came from. That means the outer ear is not just a funnel, it is a filter as well. The folds of the pinna reflect and reshape incoming sound differently depending on the angle from which it arrives. A sound coming from above is altered a little differently than a sound from below. Something in front of you reaches the ear in one pattern, while the same sound from behind reaches it in another. These changes are subtle, but the brain is excellent at learning them. Over time, it uses those differences to help judge location, especially in the vertical plane, where simple left-right timing differences are not enough. You do not usually feel yourself calculating any of this. You simply hear a bird in a tree rather than on the ground, or notice that a voice is behind you rather than in front. But the pinna has already done part of that work before the deeper hearing system even gets its turn. Humans are not especially dramatic in the way we use our outer ears. Many animals have far more mobile pinnae. Cats rotate theirs with elegant suspicion. Dogs can angle them toward faint sounds with impressive speed. Horses can point them in different directions altogether, which feels slightly unfair if one is trying to compete in the category of acoustic awareness. Human pinnae do not swivel in such a theatrical way. The tiny muscles around them exist, but in most people they are not particularly useful. Some individuals can wiggle their ears and instantly become the centre of attention at family gatherings, but this has limited value in auditory neuroscience. Even without that mobility though, the human pinna still matters a great deal because its fixed shape contributes important information to what the brain receives. The pinna is made mostly of elastic cartilage covered by skin. That cartilage gives it shape while still allowing some flexibility. It can survive the ordinary insults of life reasonably well, which is fortunate because ears are placed in a region of the body that regularly collides with pillows, collars, weather, telephones, headphones, and the occasional over-enthusiastic hood. The earlobe, interestingly, has no cartilage. It is mostly fatty tissue and connective tissue, and seems to have taken on the role of looking soft while contributing very little to the actual mechanics of hearing. It has become culturally important for earrings and other adornments, but acoustically it is not pulling much weight compared with the ridged upper portions of the auricle. If you look more closely at the pinna, its individual features begin to seem less decorative and more purposeful. The outer rim is called the helix. Just inside that is the antihelix. There is the concha, a bowl-like depression leading toward the canal, the tragus, the antitragus, and other small landmarks that anatomy students learn with varying levels of delight. Together, these structures create a contoured surface that interacts with sound in very specific ways. Some frequencies are boosted, others are dampened slightly. The exact effect depends on the direction of the incoming wave and the shape of the individual ear. In a sense, every ear has its own acoustic profile. Your pinna is part receiving dish, part sculptor, gently reshaping the wave before it continues its journey inward. This is one reason the brain can adapt to the sound signatures of the ears it grows up with. Experiments have shown that when the shape of the pinna is altered temporarily, such as with molds that change its contours, people initially become worse at locating sounds, especially above and below. Over time, though, the brain learns the new cues and improves again. Remove the mold, and there is another period of adjustment. This says something rather lovely about hearing. It is not just a matter of anatomy sitting there and working in isolation. It is a partnership between structure and interpretation. The pinna shapes the wave. The brain learns the pattern. Together they create spatial awareness. The pinna also provides a modest amount of physical protection. By directing sound inward through a canal rather than leaving the hearing system entirely open, the outer ear helps shelter the more delicate parts deeper inside. It is not a fortress, and it certainly does not stop every ill-advised decision involving cotton swabs, but it does create a controlled entry point. That controlled path turns out to be very important, because once sound is gathered by the pinna, it travels into the external auditory canal, often called the ear canal, and the canal is far more than a simple tunnel. The ear canal is a slightly curved passage leading from the concha to the eardrum. In adults, it is roughly 2.5 centimeters long, though of course human bodies enjoy variety and refuse to be identical just to satisfy textbook neatness. The canal is not a straight, rigid pipe. It has a shape that helps protect the eardrum from direct injury and influences the way sound travels inward. The outer portion contains cartilage, while the inner portion is surrounded by bone. The skin lining it is thin, especially in the deeper bony part, which is one reason irritation there can be surprisingly uncomfortable. The canal also contains tiny hairs and specialised glands that produce cerumen, better known as earwax, a substance that enjoys a poor public reputation despite being a loyal and useful servant. Earwax is one of those bodily materials that sounds unpleasant until you understand what it is doing. It helps trap dust, small particles, and potential irritants before they can reach the eardrum. It also helps moisturise the skin of the canal and has protective properties that discourage bacterial and fungal growth. In other words, it cleans, lubricates, and defends. That is more than many glamorous products can honestly claim. Usually the ear manages its wax just fine on its own. Movements of the jaw, along with the natural migration of skin cells, gradually carry wax outward where it can be wiped away from the outer ear. Trouble tends to begin when people decide the canal must be excavated with determination and household tools, at which point wax is often pushed deeper rather than removed. The ear canal, it turns out, does not appreciate overhelpful management. Beyond its role as a protected passage, the canal also affects sound acoustically. It acts as a resonant tube, meaning certain frequencies are naturally amplified as sound travels through it. In humans, this resonance tends to boost frequencies in the range that is especially important for understanding speech. That is a useful bit of design. The outer ear is not merely passing sound along unchanged. It is already favouring some of the information that matters most in social life. Human speech carries much of its intelligibility in a frequency range where the combined effects of the pinna and canal provide noticeable support. If nature had intended us to spend our evenings deciphering whale songs, or the complaints of distant machinery instead, one suspects the tuning might have gone another way. The canal's shape matters here. Because it is not infinitely wide or shallow, it supports some wavelengths better than others. The result is a kind of natural acoustic emphasis. This does not mean the canal is choosing words for you or acting like a tiny sound engineer with strong opinions. It simply means that its size and structure make some frequencies resonate more efficiently. The outer ear, taken together, gives the sound a small but meaningful nudge before it ever reaches the eardrum. This becomes especially important in quiet settings or when trying to understand speech against mild background noise. The human hearing system is dealing with pressure waves that can be astonishingly small, especially at low sound levels. Any helpful shaping or amplification before the signal reaches the more delicate structures deeper inside is valuable. The outer ear, in that sense, is an elegant preliminary device. It does not solve hearing by itself, but it improves the raw material. Another quiet virtue of the outer ear is that it helps hearing remain directional in the midst of a messy acoustic world. Two ears placed on opposite sides of the head already give the brain useful differences in timing and loudness. A sound from the right arrives at the right ear a tiny bit earlier and often slightly stronger than at the left. The head itself creates what is called an acoustic shadow, blocking some of the higher frequencies from reaching the far ear as strongly. But the pinnae add another layer by shaping the sound according to angle. The brain combines all of these clues: timing, intensity, spectral shaping. Together they allow a remarkable sense of auditory space. This is why hearing is not only about detecting that a sound exists, it is also about locating it. In everyday life, that ability is enormously useful. It helps you turn toward a speaker. It helps you identify where traffic is coming from. It helps you notice that a dropped object landed under the chair rather than behind the desk. It helps a parent hear which room the crash came from and decide how urgently to stand up. The outer ear contributes to all of this without fanfare. There is also an interesting relationship between the size and shape of the outer ear and the frequencies it handles best. Smaller structures interact differently with sound than larger ones, and different species reflect this beautifully. Animals with very large pinnae may have hearing adapted for detecting specific frequency ranges or for gathering faint sounds over greater distances. Human ears are modest by comparison, but they suit our needs well. We are highly social primates who rely heavily on spoken communication, and our outer ears reflect that. They are not built to swivel dramatically across a moonlit field toward the tread of a mouse. They are built to help support speech, environmental awareness, and the subtle location of sounds in complex surroundings. The outer ear also develops over time, and hearing through it is not quite identical across the lifespan. In infants and small children, the structures are smaller and still maturing, which affects acoustics somewhat. As people age, the cartilage of the pinna may change, and the skin and glands of the canal may behave differently. Earwax may become drier. The canal may be more prone to blockage. The appearance of the outer ear often changes more than people expect, which is why older ears sometimes seem to have decided on continued personal growth, even when the rest of the body has become less enthusiastic about that sort of thing. None of this alters the basic role of the outer ear, but it does remind us that hearing anatomy is living tissue, not an unchanging instrument. Sometimes the outer ear becomes more noticeable when something goes wrong. A simple wax blockage can make the world sound muffled and distant, as though someone has draped a blanket over the edges of reality. Swelling or infection in the ear canal, often called otitis externa or swimmer's ear, can make the canal tender and narrow, altering sound transmission and making ordinary touches unexpectedly miserable. Deformities of the outer ear present from birth can affect how sound is collected and how well it reaches the deeper structures. Even posture and external pressure can matter a little. Cover the ears with your hands and the world changes immediately. Cup them forward and some sounds seem louder or closer. The fact that such a simple gesture changes hearing at all is a nice reminder that the outer ear is always participating, even when it goes unnoticed. One might imagine the outer ear as a sort of attentive doorway. It does not understand the message, it does not identify music or language or danger, but it is not passive wood and hinges either. It is shaped to receive, to guide, and to prepare. It takes the broad, unruly movement of air and gives it a path. It uses contours and cavity size to emphasize some frequencies and alter others. It helps the brain detect location by leaving a directional signature on incoming sound. It protects the delicate root inward with skin, hairs, curvature, and wax. All of this happens before the eardrum even trembles, and the eardrum is waiting at the inner end of the canal like a very delicate listener of its own. Every sound that reaches it has already been gathered by the pinna, slightly filtered by the folds of the auricle, guided through the canal, perhaps mildly amplified at useful frequencies, and protected along the way from some of the world's dust and debris. By the time the wave reaches that membrane, it is still sound, still a moving pattern of pressure, but it has been shaped. The outer ear has done its part. There is something pleasingly humble about that role. The outer ear does not get the fame of the brain, or the mysterious elegance of the cochlea. It is not usually the part people think about when they think of hearing. Yet without it, the whole process begins at a disadvantage. Sound would still exist, and deeper structures might still respond, but the careful gathering and directional shaping that make human hearing so useful in daily life would be diminished. The visible ear, odd little fold that it is, deserves more gratitude than it gets. So when sound arrives from somewhere out in the room, it does not simply strike a generic opening in the side of the head. It meets contours, curves, a resonant passage, a guarded route inward. It is collected, guided, and subtly edited. Then, at the far end of that narrow canal, it reaches a thin membrane stretched under just the right tension, waiting to do something extraordinary with the pressure that has crossed the air to find it. Because the next step is the moment where moving air stops being only air and begins to become motion inside the body. There is a moment in the path of hearing where the world stops being something outside you and begins very literally to move inside you. That moment happens at the eardrum. Up to this point, sound has still belonged to the outer world. It has been a travelling wave in the air, collected by the pinna, guided through the ear canal, shaped a little by the curves and resonance of the outer ear, but still unmistakably external. Then it reaches a thin membrane stretched across the end of the canal, and everything changes. Air pressure becomes motion. Sound stops being only something around you, and begins to act directly on the body. The eardrum, also called the tympanic membrane, is one of those structures that is easy to underestimate because it is so thin and so hidden. No one sees it in daily life. It is tucked away at the far end of the canal, doing its work in darkness, and unless you've had an ear infection, a medical examination, or the unfortunate experience of sudden pressure or pain, you may never think about it at all. But it is one of the great conversion points in the body. It takes a pressure wave that travelled through the air and turns that wave into mechanical vibration. Without that step, hearing does not move forward. The sound may arrive at the ear, but it goes no farther in any useful sense. The structure itself is delicate, but not fragile in the way people sometimes imagine. Thin, yes. Sensitive, absolutely. Yet built with a surprising degree of resilience. The eardrum is a membrane made of several layers, arranged in a way that gives it both tension and flexibility. It is stretched across the boundary between the outer ear and the middle ear like the skin of a tiny drum, which is exactly why the name feels so fitting. When the pressure in the ear canal rises and falls with a passing sound wave, the membrane moves back and forth in response. Very small motions, often unimaginably small, but real and precise. This is worth pausing over because hearing depends on movement that would be invisible to the naked eye. A quiet sound does not slap the eardrum around with theatrical energy. It nudges it. The membrane responds to minute changes in pressure, moving enough to preserve information about the sound's timing, frequency, and intensity. That is the remarkable part. The eardrum is not simply flapping about in some general way. It is moving with discipline. If a voice produces a complex pattern of vibrations, the membrane reflects that complexity. If a violin note is high and steady, the membrane moves accordingly. If a sudden clap arrives with force, the motion changes again. The eardrum does not understand what the sound means, of course, but it preserves the structure of the signal with astonishing loyalty. Its shape helps with that job. The tympanic membrane is not stretched flat like a sheet pulled across a frame. It has a slight cone-like form, drawn inward toward the middle ear by its connection to one of the tiny hearing bones, the malleus. This gives it a geometry that helps it respond efficiently to sound. Different parts of the membrane may move a little differently depending on frequency, and although the details can become wonderfully technical if one chooses to wander into them, the broader truth is simple enough. The shape and tension of the membrane are part of what make it such an effective translator of air pressure into motion. The comparison to a drum is useful, but only if taken gently. A large drum skin is designed to produce sound when struck. The eardrum is doing something almost opposite. It is designed to receive sound and pass its vibration onward. It is not a performer. It is a listener with excellent reflexes. The wave reaches it, and it yields just enough. Then it recovers. Then it moves again, over and over, all day, every day, through whispered conversation, clattering dishes, footsteps, laughter, rain, music, engines, coughs, birds, and all the rest of life's acoustic clutter. Because the eardrum sits between the outer ear and the middle ear, it has to live with two very different kinds of challenge. On the outside is the changing world of air pressure and environmental sound. On the inside is the air-filled chamber of the middle ear, where the tiny ossicles will soon take over the work. For the membrane to move well, the pressure on both sides has to remain reasonably balanced. That is why the middle ear's connection to the throat through the eustachian tube matters so much. If pressure builds unevenly across the membrane, its movement becomes restricted. You hear this as muffling, fullness, or the strange sense that sound has gone slightly thick around the edges. Anyone who has flown in an airplane or ridden up a mountain knows this sensation well. The air pressure around you changes, and if the middle ear has not equalised yet, the eardrum gets pushed inward or outward more than usual. Suddenly hearing feels dull. Your own voice may sound odd inside your head. Then you swallow, yawn, chew, or perform some other little act of persuasion, and at last there is that familiar pop. The pressures even out, the membrane returns to a better resting position, and hearing clears. It is such an ordinary event that people rarely stop to admire it, but it is another reminder that the eardrum is a mechanical structure, and mechanics are sensitive to conditions. This balance matters because the eardrum is trying to do something quite demanding. It needs to be stable enough to maintain its shape, but free enough to move with tiny changes in pressure. Too stiff, and soft sounds would fail to move it adequately. Too loose, and it would not transmit vibration with the right precision. It is one of those biological compromises that seems almost elegant in its modesty. The membrane is not perfect in some absolute engineering sense. Biology rarely aims for that sort of vanity. It is effective, adaptable, and good enough to support an astonishing range of hearing tasks in an untidy living world. When a sound wave travels down the ear canal, it creates alternating areas of slightly higher and slightly lower pressure against the outer surface of the eardrum. The membrane responds by moving inward and outward in step with those changes. Low-frequency sounds make it move more slowly back and forth. High-frequency sounds drive faster oscillations. Louder sounds create larger movements. Quieter sounds create smaller ones. The point is not simply that the membrane moves, but that its movement carries detailed information about the original sound. This is the first truly intimate mechanical copy of the world's vibration inside the hearing system. At this stage, the sound is still not a nerve signal. Nothing electrical has happened yet in the sense that will matter later in the cochlea and auditory nerve. The eardrum is part of the mechanical phase of hearing. That can be easy to overlook because we often jump mentally from sound in the air straight to sound in the brain, but the body does not skip steps just because the mind likes neat shortcuts. It proceeds carefully. First pressure, then membrane motion, then bone motion, then fluid motion deeper inside, then specialized cells transforming that movement into electrical activity, then nerve signals, then brain interpretation. The eardrum stands at the beginning of that long chain and says, quite literally, I will take the first impact. The membrane does not work alone, of course. Attached to its inner side is the handle of the malleus, the first of the 3 tiny ossicles of the middle ear. When the eardrum moves, it pulls and pushes on the malleus. In that sense, the membrane is not just vibrating in isolation like a leaf in the breeze, it is connected to the next mechanical stage. Its movements are immediately passed onward. That connection is part of why the eardrum has its characteristic inward shape. The malleus draws it gently toward the middle ear, creating a central point from which motion can be efficiently transferred. There is something satisfying about this arrangement. The outer ear guides sound to a membrane. The membrane does not hoard the information, it hands it over. Hearing is a chain of custody. Each structure receives the wave in one form and passes it on in another. The eardrum's duty is not glamorous, but it is essential and beautifully timed. It does not hesitate, annotate, or editorialize. It moves. That movement must also happen across a huge range of sounds. Think about the difference between a near whisper and a slammed door. The intensity difference is enormous, yet the same basic hearing pathway must remain functional across both. The eardrum cannot treat every sound as equally urgent, nor can it freeze at every loud event or ignore every soft one. It must remain responsive but not chaotic, sensitive but not uselessly fragile. Biology solves this partly through the design of the membrane itself and partly through protective mechanisms farther along in the middle ear, where tiny muscles can reduce the transmission of excessive vibration under certain circumstances. Even so, very loud sounds can still be damaging. The hearing system is clever, not indestructible. The eardrum also has another role that deserves attention, and that is separation. It forms a boundary between the outer ear canal and the middle ear cavity. This matters for more than just sound transmission. It helps protect the middle ear from direct exposure to the outside environment. The world is full of dust, water, bacteria, pressure changes, and all sorts of poorly behaved elements. The tympanic membrane is part of what keeps that outer world from having unrestricted access inward. In that sense, it is both gateway and guard. It receives vibration, but it also maintains a physical divide. Because it is thin and actively involved in motion, the eardrum can become inflamed or impaired when things go wrong. Infections of the middle ear can create fluid and pressure behind it, making movement more difficult and often painful. A simple cold in childhood can become an acoustic nuisance, because swelling around the eustachian tube prevents proper ventilation of the middle ear, and suddenly the eardrum is trapped in an unhappy mechanical situation. People often describe muffled hearing, pressure, discomfort, or a sense that the ear is blocked from the inside. All of that reflects the same underlying truth. The membrane cannot move normally when its conditions are disturbed. Perforation too is possible. A sudden pressure change, direct trauma, infection, or an ill-advised object entering the ear canal can tear the membrane. That sounds dramatic because it is dramatic, although the body is sometimes surprisingly capable of healing small perforations over time. Still, it is a sharp reminder that the eardrum is not just a metaphorical drum in poetic anatomy language. It is a real, physical membrane with real, physical limits, and its ordinary invisibility should not mislead us into forgetting how much hearing depends on its quiet reliability. There is also an important subtlety here. The eardrum is not simply bouncing like a cartoon trampoline, with every bit of it moving in exactly the same way all at once. At lower frequencies, much of the membrane may move more uniformly. At higher frequencies, patterns can become more complex. Different regions of the membrane may show slightly different behavior depending on the incoming sound. This is not a flaw. It is part of the richness of mechanical transmission. The body does not always operate like a single rigid lever. It uses tissues that respond with nuance. For a listener drifting towards sleep, it is enough to know that the eardrum is sensitive enough to mirror sound with tremendous detail, and that detail matters because everything farther in depends on receiving a faithful version of the motion. One of the loveliest things about the eardrum is how unassuming it is. There is no sensation attached to its routine labour. You do not feel it working as you listen to a song. You do not notice the membrane trembling when someone murmurs nearby. Even in silence, it waits in readiness, tense but calm, prepared for the next wave of air pressure that happens to reach it. And because we live in a world where sounds come and go constantly, this means the membrane is almost never truly off duty. It may rest between notable events, but there is usually some hum, some rustle, some distant motion finding its way down the canal. The eardrum is a patient employee in a company that never really closes. This can make one appreciate how strange hearing actually is. A pressure fluctuation in the air, produced by an object or a voice somewhere beyond your skin, crosses space, enters a curved canal in the side of your head, and moves a membrane so delicate that you cannot see it without help. That movement is enough to begin a cascade that ends with recognition, emotion, memory, and meaning. You hear a single word and feel comfort. You hear a sudden noise and startle. You hear a melody and remember a room from years ago. All of that begins here, at a membrane that knows nothing of language or memory. It only knows how to move accurately. The eardrum is also a lovely example of how hearing is never purely passive. People sometimes speak of the ear as though it were merely an opening through which sound pours, but the reality is more active and more precise. The membrane is under tension. It has a resting state. It interacts with the middle ear bones. It depends on pressure regulation. It participates in the body's dynamic response to sound. Even when it is simply doing its normal job, it is doing more than letting sound in. It is transforming one form of energy into another stage of motion suitable for deeper processing. And because it is the first true mechanical handoff point in hearing, it also marks a kind of threshold in the story. Everything before it has been preparation. The world vibrates, the outer ear gathers, the canal guides. But at the eardrum, the hearing system properly takes hold of the sound. Here the air's pattern becomes the body's movement. Here the message stops travelling only through open space and begins travelling through anatomy. It is not difficult to see why medicine pays close attention to this structure. A doctor looking into the ear with an otoscope is not just admiring biological craftsmanship, though there is certainly room for that. They are checking a membrane whose colour, position, translucence and integrity tell a story about the condition of the ear. A healthy eardrum often appears pearly grey and appropriately placed. A bulging one may suggest pressure or infection behind it. A retracted one may hint at poor ventilation in the middle ear. A perforated one speaks for itself rather bluntly. In a way, the eardrum is not just part of hearing. It is also a visible report on the state of the hearing pathway up to that point. Still, tonight the more comforting thought is simply this. Somewhere just beyond the reach of ordinary awareness, a thin membrane is carrying out one of the most delicate and important acts in sensation. It receives the world not as objects, colours or meanings, but as tiny waves of pressure. It does not complain about repetition. It does not ask for applause. It answers each wave with motion and passes that motion inward faithfully. The whisper and the thunder both arrive. The membrane responds, over and over, and it cannot keep the work for itself. The eardrum is only the beginning of the inner mechanics. Once it moves, it tugs on the first of 3 tiny bones waiting in the air-filled chamber beyond. A chain so small and so efficient that it can take the membrane's fragile vibrations and give them more power, more focus, and more momentum for the fluid-filled world ahead, where the next hidden machinery is already waiting. Just beyond the eardrum, in a small air-filled space hidden inside the skull, there is a chain of bones so tiny that it sounds almost impractical that they could matter as much as they do. And yet these 3 bones are essential. Without them, hearing in air would be far weaker, much duller, and far less efficient. They are called the ossicles, and they form the mechanical core of the middle ear. If the outer ear gathers the world and the eardrum receives it, the middle ear takes that delicate motion and does something very clever with it. It carries it inward, strengthens it, and prepares it for a much more difficult environment ahead. This is one of the most important facts in hearing, and it is easy to miss because the system works so smoothly that we almost never notice the problem it is solving. Sound reaches the eardrum as a wave moving through air. That makes sense because we live in air, speak into air, and spend most of our waking lives surrounded by it. But deeper inside the ear, where sound will eventually be turned into nerve signals, things are no longer air-filled in the same way. The inner ear is fluid-filled. That creates a challenge. Sound does not pass from air into fluid very efficiently on its own. A large portion of the energy would simply bounce away, or be lost if the body did not intervene with some elegant mechanics. The middle ear is that intervention. It is the body's way of saying, no, we are not wasting this signal. We will give it a better entrance. The 3 ossicles are called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Their older common names are wonderfully descriptive: hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Those names are not perfectly literal, but they are close enough to help the imagination. The malleus is attached to the inner surface of the eardrum. The incus sits between the others. The stapes is the smallest of the 3 and presses against an opening into the inner ear called the oval window. Together they form a linked mechanical chain. When the eardrum moves, the malleus moves with it. The malleus pushes on the incus moves the stapes. The stapes then presses on the oval window, and from there the motion enters the fluid-filled cochlea. It is tempting to picture these bones as rigid little sticks simply passing along a shove, but the truth is more refined than that. They are shaped, angled, suspended, and connected in ways that allow efficient transfer of force. The joints between them are small and specialized. Ligaments help support them in the middle ear cavity. Muscles can adjust their behavior under certain conditions. The whole arrangement is less like 3 loose bits of bone clattering around in a hollow room, and more like a miniature lever system built by someone with a deep respect for precision. It is all hidden away so quietly that you never get to see the performance, only the result. The middle ear itself is a cavity filled with air. That detail matters. The eardrum has air on one side through the ear canal, and the ossicles sit in an air-filled chamber on the other side. This means that the eardrum is free to vibrate in response to sound without being burdened by thick fluid immediately behind it. The cavity allows movement. It provides space for the ossicles to do their work. It also has to remain connected to the broader pressure environment of the body, which is why the eustachian tube will soon become so important. But for now, it is enough to picture this chamber as a tiny room of moving parts, tucked within bone, where every sound that reaches your ear is mechanically reworked before it continues inward. The malleus is the first bone in line, and because it is attached to the eardrum, it receives motion directly from that membrane. When the eardrum moves inward, the malleus follows. When the membrane moves outward, the malleus follows again. That motion is transferred to the incus, which acts as the middle link. The incus then passes the movement to the stapes. The stapes is remarkable not only because it is the smallest bone in the human body, but because its footplate sits against the oval window, the entrance through which mechanical vibration begins influencing the fluid of the inner ear. So the middle ear does not merely move sound along in a general direction. It concentrates the signal toward a very small target. That concentration is part of the amplification. The middle ear increases the pressure delivered to the inner ear in two major ways. One has to do with surface area. The eardrum is much larger than the oval window. When force collected over the broad surface of the eardrum is transferred through the ossicles to the much smaller area of the oval window, the pressure increases. It is the same basic reason that pressing with a narrow point produces more pressure than pressing with a broad flat surface. The other source of amplification comes from the lever-like action of the ossicles themselves. The malleus and incus are arranged so that the system provides a mechanical advantage. Together, these effects help compensate for the loss that would otherwise occur when sound tries to move from air into fluid. This is sometimes described as impedance matching, which sounds slightly stern and mathematical, but the idea is simple enough. Air and fluid respond differently to vibration. If you try to send sound directly from air into fluid without a middle ear, much of the energy reflects back rather than entering efficiently. The middle ear matches the two environments better by increasing pressure at the point of transfer. It is a translation device in the most physical sense. It does not change the essential information carried by the sound, but it changes the form in which that information is delivered so that the inner ear can actually make use of it. Without that adjustment, hearing through air would be greatly reduced, especially for softer sounds. One can get a rough sense of the middle ear's importance by thinking about what happens when its function is impaired. If fluid builds up behind the eardrum, if the ossicles cannot move well, if the pressure in the middle ear is wrong, or if the chain is interrupted in some way, sound no longer reaches the inner ear with the same efficiency. Hearing becomes muffled. Speech loses sharpness. The world may feel duller, as though it has retreated a little and wrapped itself in cloth. This kind of hearing difficulty is called conductive hearing loss, because the problem lies in conducting sound to the inner ear, not necessarily in sensing it once it gets there. It is another reminder that the middle ear is not an optional convenience, it is part of the main route. The ossicles are small, but they are not simple. Each has a particular shape that suits its role. The malleus has a handle-like portion attached to the eardrum. The incus has a body and processes that articulate with its neighbours. The stapes, with its stirrup-like form, has a footplate that sits in the oval window. These bones are covered by mucous membrane within the cavity, and they are suspended in such a way that they can move with exquisite subtlety. The entire system is tiny enough to be easy to ignore in thought, yet it handles a broad range of frequencies and sound intensities with remarkable fidelity. This is one of the quiet triumphs of anatomy. Hearing depends on the preservation of detail. A voice is not just a single vibration, it is a complex pattern. Music is richer still. The middle ear must pass along the timing and structure of that pattern accurately enough that the cochlea can later sort frequencies and the brain can later identify meaning. If the ossicles moved in some sloppy, generalized way, hearing would be crude and blurred. Instead, they preserve delicate changes in the incoming signal. Even though they amplify, they do not do so by turning everything into a blunt shove. They strengthen the motion while keeping its information intact. The middle ear is also dynamic in another sense. It contains two very small muscles, the tensor tympani and the stapedius. These muscles are not there for drama. They exist to adjust the mechanical behaviour of the system, especially in response to loud sounds. When activated, they reduce the movement of the ossicular chain, helping decrease the amount of vibration passed into the inner ear. This is known as the acoustic reflex. It is a protective mechanism, though not a perfect one. It works best for sustained or predictable loud sounds rather than sudden explosive ones. It is part of why your own voice and chewing do not overwhelm your hearing system as much as they otherwise might. The body anticipates some of the noise it makes for itself and moderates the transmission. The stapedius is especially famous because it is the smallest skeletal muscle in the body. It attaches to the stapes and helps control its movement. The tensor tympani is linked more to the malleus and eardrum tension. Together they can stiffen the system, reducing how freely vibrations pass through. The effect is not dramatic enough to make a rock concert harmless, or a thunderclap gentle, but it is still useful. It is rather like dimming the mechanical input a little when the environment gets too forceful. Again, the body shows its preference for adjustment rather than passivity. Hearing is not just receiving, it is managing. There is something quite endearing about the idea that your ear has a built-in reflex to say, "That is enough of that." Of course, it is not always fast enough to protect against every sudden sharp blast, and it certainly cannot solve the modern habit of placing very loud sound directly into the ear for extended periods. Biology was clever, but it did not entirely plan for enthusiastic headphone volume settings on crowded trains. Even so, the presence of these muscles reminds us that the middle ear is an active participant in hearing, not just a row of fixed parts. The middle ear cavity is also connected to the mastoid air cells in the temporal bone behind the ear, a sort of honeycomb of air-filled spaces. These areas are not usually what people think about when they think of hearing, but they are part of the broader air-filled system associated with the middle ear. They help provide space and pressure continuity. Infections can spread into these areas, which is one reason middle ear disease is taken seriously even when it begins with something as common as a cold and a blocked eustachian tube. The hearing system is tucked into bone, but it is not isolated from the practical messiness of the rest of the body. Pressure conditions remain crucial throughout all of this. The ossicles and eardrum work best when the middle ear cavity has pressure that closely matches the outside environment. If not, the eardrum becomes displaced and the ossicular chain cannot move as freely or effectively. That is why blocked ears during a flight can feel so odd. It is not merely an inconvenience. The mechanics of hearing are being subtly compromised. The whole lever and membrane system relies on balance. A pressure problem is a mechanical problem. There is another layer of wonder here, and it has to do with evolution. The bones of the mammalian middle ear are deeply tied to structures that, in distant evolutionary ancestors, had different roles associated with the jaw. Over immense spans of time, elements that once participated in one function became recruited into another. The result is the beautifully efficient hearing apparatus mammals now possess. You do not need to linger on the evolutionary details tonight for the point to be clear. The middle ear is not a random assembly. It is the outcome of long biological history, shaped into a device capable of supporting sensitive hearing in air. And it does so with a level of refinement that still feels surprising when one considers the scale involved. Scale matters because the motions here are often tiny beyond easy imagination. A soft sound may cause only minute displacement of the eardrum and ossicles, yet the system can still preserve it. A louder sound creates larger motion, but the same chain handles both. This range is one of the great strengths of the hearing apparatus. It is able to respond to faint inputs and powerful ones without needing to swap out the hardware each time, which is fortunate, because few of us would enjoy an ear that needed a short maintenance interval every time someone dropped a saucepan. The lever action of the ossicles is often described with clean textbook diagrams, but in living hearing it is not perfectly rigid or simplistic. The joints have their own small behaviours. The tissues around the bones have compliance. Frequency influences how the system moves. Some sounds are transmitted a bit better than others. The middle ear has its own natural properties, just like any physical system, but broadly speaking it works with astonishing reliability. It gives the incoming sound the boost it needs and sends it inward in a way the cochlea can use. It is also worth noticing that the middle ear must avoid adding too much of itself to the signal. Some amplification is needed, but distortion is not welcome. The system cannot decide that every voice should sound grander than it is, or that every rustle deserves operatic emphasis. It must remain neutral enough to preserve the original qualities of the sound while still solving the air-to-fluid problem. That balance between helpful amplification and faithful transmission is one more reason the middle ear deserves admiration. It is not merely louder-making machinery, it is careful machinery. In ordinary life, this tiny chain of bones is constantly in motion. Every spoken word you hear, every passing car, every distant bird, every clink of cutlery, every footstep in the corridor sets it working again. The eardrum moves, the malleus follows. The incus passes the motion along, the stapes presses at the oval window, over and over, with no conscious effort from you at all. A person can spend an entire lifetime hearing, without ever picturing these bones once. That seems slightly unfair to the bones, though one suspects they are too busy to mind. The middle ear also reminds us that hearing is not an abstract mental event that somehow happens all at once. It is built from stages. The body insists on physics first. It insists on motion, leverage, pressure, transfer. Only later does hearing become awareness, recognition, memory, language, or feeling. The middle ear sits firmly in that mechanical middle ground. It is neither the outer world nor the neural one. It is the workshop between them, and what a workshop it is. 3 tiny bones, an air-filled chamber, a pair of protective muscles, and a lever system fine enough to preserve the structure of a whisper, while strong enough to help deliver the impact of much louder sound. No grand display, no visible performance, just faithful labour in the dark. It is a strange and comforting thought that so much of what reaches your inner life depends on such small hidden architecture. Still, even this clever machinery has limits, and one of the things that most affects it is something people usually notice only as discomfort, fullness, or popping. The middle ear needs the right pressure to work properly. It needs a way to equalize with the outside world, to let air move in or out when needed, to keep the eardrum and ossicles in a condition where they can respond freely. And that means the next part of the story belongs to a narrow passage that opens into the back of the throat, quietly regulating the conditions that make all this mechanical precision possible. Hidden behind all the tiny lever work of the middle ear is a structure most people do not think about until it decides to remind them of its existence in a slightly annoying way. That reminder usually arrives on an airplane during a head cold or halfway up a mountain road, when one ear suddenly feels blocked and the world begins to sound as though it has stepped behind a wall. Then comes the swallowing, the yawning, the jaw shifting, the hopeful little wait, and at last, if all goes well, a pop, relief, sound clears, pressure eases. The machinery of hearing returns to normal. That simple moment depends on the eustachian tube, a narrow passage with a quiet but essential job. It helps regulate the air pressure of the middle ear, it helps drain fluid, and it helps keep the eardrum and ossicles working under the conditions they need. The eustachian tube is not glamorous. It is not shaped like a shell or a spiral. It does not have the elegance of the cochlea or the delicacy of the ossicles. It is more like a maintenance corridor, a hidden adjustment system running between the middle ear and the upper throat, specifically the nasopharynx, which is the space behind the nose and above the back of the mouth. In adults, it is roughly 3 to 4 centimeters long. Part of it is bony, closer to the ear, and part is cartilaginous, closer to the throat. Most of the time it stays closed. That is an important detail. It is not supposed to stand open like a tunnel with air flowing freely all day long. Instead, It opens briefly during swallowing, yawning, chewing, or certain jaw movements, then closes again. That pattern allows it to do its job without inviting too much trouble from the throat upward. Its job begins with pressure. The middle ear is an air-filled cavity, and that cavity sits on the inner side of the eardrum. The outer side of the eardrum faces the ear canal, which is open to the outside world. For the eardrum to move freely and accurately in response to sound, the pressure on both sides needs to stay reasonably equal. If the pressure outside becomes higher than the pressure in the middle ear, the membrane gets pushed inward. If the pressure inside becomes higher, the membrane bulges outward. Either way, its normal resting position is disturbed, and hearing becomes less efficient. The ossicles do not get the same clean motion from the membrane, and the whole chain begins to work at a disadvantage. The eustachian tube prevents this by giving the middle ear a way to equalize with the surrounding air pressure through the throat. This means hearing depends not only on the ability to receive sound and transmit it mechanically, but also on the ability to keep the environment of the middle ear properly tuned. That tuning is easy to overlook because when it works, you notice nothing at all. You do not sense your eustachian tubes quietly opening when you swallow. You do not hear the middle ear being ventilated. You do not thank the tube for keeping the eardrum comfortable and mobile during a change in altitude. The whole arrangement is so routine that only failure makes it obvious. The hidden systems of the body are often like this. They keep the conditions right, and only when the conditions drift do you realize how much depended on them. Think of the middle ear as a small room with delicate equipment inside. The eardrum is one wall of that room, and the ossicles are mechanical parts suspended within it. If the air in the room is too pressurized or not pressurized enough relative to the outside, the wall does not move as it should, and the machinery becomes harder to operate. The eustachian tube is the small vent that allows the room to adjust, not constantly, not dramatically, just enough. Each brief opening lets air move in or out so that the pressure can match more closely. Then the vent closes again, and the system returns to quiet readiness. That opening is helped by muscles in the surrounding region, especially during swallowing and yawning. This is why chewing gum on an airplane can be so helpful. The chewing and swallowing motions encourage the tube to open repeatedly. Each opening gives the middle ear another chance to equalize. That familiar popping sensation is often the sound or feeling of pressure finally balancing across the eardrum. It may not be elegant dinner conversation, but it is good physiology. A yawn can do the same. So can deliberate swallowing. Some people learn gentle maneuvers to help, though forceful attempts can be unwise. The body generally prefers persuasion to aggression in such matters. Air travel provides the clearest everyday lesson in this system because it changes external pressure relatively quickly. During ascent, the pressure in the cabin drops compared with the ground. During descent, it rises again. The middle ear has to keep pace. If the eustachian tube opens normally, the adjustment is manageable and may go almost unnoticed. If it does not open well, pressure differences build and the eardrum becomes stretched inward or outward. That leads to the blocked sensation, muffled hearing, discomfort, and sometimes pain. The same thing can happen during mountain drives, elevator rides in very tall buildings, or even while diving underwater, where pressure changes are far more dramatic and demand careful equalization. The body is dealing with basic physics, and the tube is the negotiation channel. There is a slight irony in the title people sometimes give this structure when they talk casually about the ear and balance. The eustachian tube does not control balance in the sense of keeping you upright or informing the brain about head movement. That work belongs mainly to the vestibular structures of the inner ear, which we will visit later. The eustachian tube handles another kind of balance, one that is no less practical. It balances pressure. It maintains environmental fairness on both sides of the eardrum. If that sounds less exciting than spinning fluids and semicircular canals, perhaps it is. But it is also indispensable. A person with a perfectly intact cochlea and beautifully working auditory nerve can still hear poorly if the middle ear pressure is badly off. Hearing is only as good as the conditions supporting its first mechanical stages. The tube also helps with drainage. the middle ear does not merely need air, it needs to remain relatively dry and clear. The lining of the middle ear and tube is a mucous membrane, and like mucous membranes elsewhere in the body, it produces secretions. Normally these are modest and handled well. The eustachian tube allows fluid to drain from the middle ear down toward the throat, where it can be cleared naturally. When drainage is impaired, fluid can accumulate in the middle ear space. That fluid interferes with sound transmission because the eardrum and ossicles no longer move under ideal conditions. The result is another version of muffled hearing, often accompanied by a sense of fullness. People sometimes describe it as hearing through water or through a layer of cotton. Children are especially familiar, whether they know it or not, with the consequences of eustachian tube trouble. In childhood, the tube is shorter, more horizontal, and generally less efficient than in adults. That makes it easier for infections and inflammation from the nose and throat to affect the middle ear, and it makes drainage less reliable. This is one reason middle ear infections are common in young children. A cold causes swelling around the opening of the tube, ventilation worsens, fluid builds up. Bacteria or viruses take advantage of the situation, pressure changes, pain follows, parents lose sleep, doctors become familiar faces. The anatomy of childhood is not faulty, but it is arranged in a way that creates this vulnerability. As children grow, the tube lengthens and becomes more angled, which usually improves function. When the eustachian tube is not working properly, the term often used is eustachian tube dysfunction. That can happen because of swelling from allergies, upper respiratory infections, sinus problems, irritation, or structural issues. It can also happen because the tube stays abnormally open in some people, a condition called a patulous eustachian tube, which creates its own strange symptoms. Instead of blocked pressure and muffled hearing, a person may hear their own voice or breathing far too loudly inside the head because the tube is not closing when it should. That is a good reminder that the correct function of the tube depends on timing and regulation, not simply openness. Closed most of the time, open briefly when needed, then closed again. A hidden adjustment system only works well when it adjusts in the right amount. The more common problem, though, is poor opening rather than too much opening. During a cold, the lining of the nose and throat becomes inflamed. Mucus increases, tissues swell, the entrance to the eustachian tube in the nasopharynx can become obstructed or functionally narrowed. Now the middle ear is cut off from easy ventilation. The air trapped inside is gradually absorbed by the lining of the middle ear, creating lower pressure there. The eardrum begins to retract inward. Hearing dulls. Pressure builds in the unpleasant sense, even though technically the pressure inside may now be lower than outside. The person simply feels that the ear is blocked. Then, if fluid starts to collect in the space, the mechanical disadvantage grows. The eardrum is displaced. The ossicles move less efficiently. Everything sounds slightly far away. This can be frustrating because the ear may otherwise look normal from the outside. The pinna is still there. The canal is still open. Nothing dramatic has happened in visible terms. But the performance of hearing has changed because the maintenance corridor behind the scenes is not doing its job well. Again, it is a lovely example of how sensation depends not only on the obvious sensory structures, but also on the support systems that keep those structures in proper working order. Doctors often look at the eardrum to judge how the eustachian tube and middle ear are behaving. A retracted eardrum may suggest negative pressure in the middle ear. Fluid behind the membrane may be visible. A bulging eardrum can reflect pressure from infection or fluid buildup pushing outward. The tympanic membrane becomes a kind of weather report for the middle ear, showing whether the pressure climate has stayed calm or turned troublesome. If the tube has failed to ventilate and drain the space properly, the eardrum often reveals it. There is also an interesting social side to the eustachian tube. Though social may be too grand a word for a structure that mainly opens when you swallow soup, still, it connects hearing to ordinary behaviours in a very direct way. Every swallow helps, every yawn helps, jaw movement matters, chewing matters. The throat and ear are not strangers. They are mechanically and functionally linked in ways that daily life constantly reveals if you pay attention. Sometimes a person notices a clicking sound in the ear when swallowing. Sometimes chewing clears one ear but not the other. Sometimes a yawn opens the world again after a flight descent. These are not random sensations. They are little signatures of the tube doing its work. Because the middle ear is an air-filled system connected to the throat, there is always a balance to strike between ventilation and protection. The tube cannot stand wide open all the time because that would invite pressure fluctuations, sound from your own breathing and speech, and possibly material from the throat to travel too freely toward the middle ear. It also cannot remain stubbornly shut when changes in altitude or fluid drainage demand action. The body solves this with a tube that is mostly collapsed at rest and opened actively when needed. That design may seem modest, but it is quite sensible. It prevents constant unwanted communication while allowing intermittent useful communication. One can almost think of it as a valve with a schedule of brief appointments. It opens, equalizes, drains, and closes. If it misses too many appointments, the middle ear begins to complain. If it attends too many or stays open carelessly, the acoustics become strange for a different reason. Hidden adjustment systems are often judged by how invisible they remain, and the eustachian tube is at its best when it gives you no reason to remember its name. Still, hearing is kinder when one does remember it. The familiar advice to avoid flying with severe nasal congestion if possible, or to be careful with diving during a cold, is not empty fussiness. It reflects the real mechanical needs of the ear. A congested nose and swollen throat tissues make it harder for the tube to open and equalize. Pressure differences become more severe. Pain or injury can follow. In diving, the stakes are higher because water pressure increases quickly with depth. Divers learn to equalize frequently and gently for exactly this reason. The eardrum and middle ear are not built to negotiate large pressure changes without help. There is something quietly reassuring in the fact that such a practical system exists. The body knows that a membrane hearing the world properly must be given the right atmospheric conditions, so it creates a tube to the throat, links it to swallowing muscles, lines it with tissue capable of drainage, and sets up a pattern of intermittent opening that generally keeps things stable. You need not supervise any of this. The ear handles its own housekeeping most of the time. Of course, housekeeping is rarely appreciated until it fails. Then the whole mood of the day changes. A blocked ear during a cold can make one feel oddly detached from conversation. One's own voice sounds too loud in the head. Speech from others loses sharpness. Sounds no longer sit where they should in space. There may be pressure, discomfort, or a sense of being slightly underwater. This is not because the brain has forgotten how to hear. It is because the middle ear has lost the conditions it needs for sound to travel cleanly. The eustachian tube, though small and hidden, has a large say in how open the world feels. And that leads to another important point. The eustachian tube is not part of the final interpretation of sound. It does not separate pitches, identify voices, or decide whether a sound is music or warning. What it does is more foundational. It protects the mechanical honesty of the hearing process. It keeps the eardrum and ossicles in a workable state. It helps preserve the starting conditions from which all deeper hearing depends. Without that, the finer sensory cells of the inner ear would receive a poorer signal, and all the exquisite work beyond would begin from a compromised input. So while it may seem like a minor side passage in the anatomy of the ear, it is really a quiet partner in the entire act of hearing. Pressure equalization, drainage, ventilation, protection by timed opening and closing. No poetry required, no mystery necessary, just clean practical design, doing exactly what the rest of the system needs. Once those conditions are right, the eardrum can move as it should. The ossicles can leverage and amplify as they should. And then the stapes, smallest of the bones, can press against the oval window and send that carefully preserved motion into a very different kind of world. Not air now, but fluid. Not a tiny chamber with bones, but a coiled inner structure where pressure waves become something far more specialized. Because beyond the middle ear's maintenance and mechanics lies the cochlea, the spiral organ that takes vibration and begins the far stranger task of turning it into signal. If the middle ear is a tiny mechanical workshop, then the cochlea is where the work changes completely. Up to this point, hearing has still been a story of air and motion in a fairly familiar physical sense. Sound travelled through the air, the eardrum moved, the ossicles carried and strengthened that movement. The eustachian tube quietly kept the conditions right so that all of this could happen efficiently. But now the signal reaches the threshold of the inner ear, and everything becomes more specialised. The stapes presses at the oval window, and beyond that window lies the cochlea, a coiled, fluid-filled structure tucked deep within the temporal bone. This is where vibration begins to be transformed into something the nervous system can use. This is where the ear stops merely passing movement along and begins converting it into signal. The cochlea is often described as snail-shaped, which is not inaccurate, though one always feels slightly apologetic comparing one of the most refined sensory organs in the body to a garden creature inching through damp leaves. Still, the image is useful because it captures the structure's coiled form. If you could unroll it, the cochlea would be a tapered tube, narrower toward one end and wider at the other. Coiled tightly into a spiral, it fits compactly inside the skull, while preserving a long internal path along which mechanical events can unfold. Nature is quite fond of this sort of arrangement. Spirals are efficient, they save space. They allow length without demanding a room in a straight line. In the cochlea, that compact curl houses a detailed system for sorting sound and turning it into the language of the brain. The first thing to understand is that the cochlea is filled with fluid, not air. That matters enormously because the whole point of the middle ear's amplification was to get vibration into this fluid-filled world effectively. The footplate of the stape sits at the oval window, a membrane-covered opening into the cochlea. When the stapes moves in and out, it pushes on the fluid inside. This creates a pressure wave that travels through the cochlear chambers. So the mechanical story continues, but the medium has changed. No longer air moving in a canal or bones moving in a cavity. Now it is fluid motion in a sealed inner structure. The cochlea contains 3 parallel fluid-filled compartments, and although their names sound a little formal, they are worth knowing because they help explain how the structure works. The upper chamber is the scala vestibulae. The lower chamber is the scala tympani. Between them lies the scala media, also called the cochlear duct. The scala vestibulae and scala tympani contain a fluid called perilymph, while the scala media contains endolymph, a fluid with a somewhat different composition. This arrangement is not decorative. The separation of these chambers and their fluids is part of the highly controlled environment the sensory cells need. When the stapes pushes at the oval window, it sets up movement in the fluid of the scala vestibulae. Pressure travels along the cochlea, eventually influencing the membranes and structures that separate the chambers. Because fluids do not compress easily, movement has to go somewhere. This is why the cochlea also has another flexible opening, the round window, which bulges slightly to accommodate pressure changes. The oval window receives the push in. The round window allows corresponding motion out. Without that release, the system would be too rigid to work properly. Again, the body shows its practical intelligence. If one membrane is going to drive a fluid wave into a compact structure, another membrane had better be available to yield. Otherwise, the whole beautiful idea becomes mechanically stubborn. Running through the cochlea is one of the most important structures in hearing, the basilar membrane. This membrane forms the floor of the scala media and supports the organ that contains the sensory cells responsible for converting motion into electrical activity. The basilar membrane is not the same all along its length. Near the base of the cochlea, where the oval window is, it is narrower and stiffer. Toward the apex, farther around the spiral, it becomes wider and more flexible. That gradual change in mechanical properties is central to how the cochlea sorts different frequencies. High-frequency sounds tend to create their strongest effects near the stiff base, Low-frequency sounds travel farther and affect the more flexible regions toward the apex. In this way, the cochlea does not just receive sound, it analyzes it mechanically. Different pitches are separated out by where along the basilar membrane the wave has its greatest effect. This is one of the most elegant ideas in sensory biology. The world sends in a complex sound, and the cochlea begins sorting it by physical properties before the brain ever gets involved. A high note and a low note do not merely feel different later in consciousness. They create different patterns of motion in different parts of the cochlea right from the start. That organisation, sometimes called tonotopy, is maintained all the way up the auditory system. The cochlea lays down a kind of frequency map, and the nervous system preserves it. So a sound is not only converted into signal, it is also arranged. It is easy to speak of all this in a dry mechanical way and forget how astonishing it really is. You hear a chord played on a piano, and inside your skull this tiny spiral organ begins to separate the frequencies involved, each one creating its own region of activity along a membrane coiled deep in bone. You hear the rustle of paper, the hum of a refrigerator, the sweep of traffic, the soft edge of a spoken consonant, and the cochlea begins parsing those patterns immediately. It does not wait for the brain to sort out the basics. It starts the sorting itself. Within the scala media, resting on the basilar membrane, is the organ of Corti, the true sensory organ of hearing. We will spend much more time with its hair cells and their specific role very soon, because the next part of the story belongs especially to them. For tonight, it is enough to say that the organ of Corti contains the cells that respond to movement between structures within the cochlea and begin the conversion from mechanical force to neural signal. If the basilar membrane is the stage on which the cochlea sorts vibration, the organ of Corti is the cast waiting to interpret that motion and pass the message onward. Above the hair cells lies another structure called the tectorial membrane. The relationship between the basilar membrane below and the tectorial membrane above is part of what allows tiny movements in the cochlear fluids to become meaningful stimulation for the sensory cells. When the basilar membrane moves in response to a passing wave, there is a relative motion within this tiny architecture. The hair cells are bent, and that bending is what begins the chain of events leading to electrical signalling. But again, the details of those remarkable cells deserve their own slower treatment. For now, the important thing is to see the cochlea as a carefully arranged hydraulic and mechanical analyzer, a place where incoming vibration creates specific patterns of motion in a structure built to sort and detect them. The spiral shape of the cochlea helps keep this whole system compact, but it also gives the structure a certain hidden beauty. Deep in the bone, out of sight, it curls inward like a secret shell. It is not a simple cavity. It is a layered, partitioned, fluid-driven instrument. If a person had no knowledge of anatomy and someone described it from scratch, it might sound a little too elaborate to be true. A coiled organ in the skull that receives motion from a stirrup-shaped bone, channels waves through fluid-filled chambers, sorts frequencies by membrane stiffness, and uses microscopic hair-like structures to begin generating electrical impulses. One would be forgiven for suspecting a touch of embellishment. And yet that is exactly what is there. The cochlea also shows how hearing depends on controlled environments. The fluids must have the right composition. The membranes must have the right tension and flexibility. The sensory cells must be positioned with great accuracy. The pressure introduced at the oval window must be able to travel and then release appropriately at the round window. If these conditions are disturbed, hearing suffers. This can happen through noise damage, aging, certain medications, infections, genetic conditions, circulatory problems, or diseases affecting the inner ear. Unlike the outer and middle ear, where wax pressure imbalance or fluid often cause conductive problems, the cochlea is the site of sensorineural hearing, and when damage occurs here, the effects can be more lasting because the sensory cells of the inner ear are not readily replaced in humans. That makes the cochlea both magnificent and vulnerable. It performs one of the most precise tasks in the body, but it does so using cells and structures that can be injured by excess. Loud noise is a common example. The hair cells and supporting structures within the cochlea can be overstressed by intense sound. Sometimes the result is temporary, a ringing sensation, or muffled hearing after a concert, perhaps accompanied by a vague promise to oneself to be more careful next time. Sometimes the damage is permanent. This is because the cochlea is handling real mechanical energy. However refined the process becomes, the inner ear is not merely abstractly processing sound. It is responding to physical movement, and too much movement can do harm. Age, too, often leaves its mark here. Many people gradually lose sensitivity to higher frequencies as the years pass, partly because the base of the cochlea, which is especially involved in high-frequency hearing, tends to show age-related wear first. The result may be difficulty hearing certain consonants, especially in noisy environments, even when overall loudness seems adequate. This is not simply the world mumbling, though it can feel that way. It is often the cochlea becoming less able to represent those finer high-frequency details. Still, when healthy, the cochlea is astonishingly sensitive. It responds to tiny motions. The displacement involved in hearing soft sounds can be unimaginably small, and yet the cochlear structures can detect and interpret those motions with extraordinary precision. At the same time, the ear must also handle much louder sounds without instant collapse. That range is one of hearing's marvels. The cochlea is not only sensitive, it is adaptable. It responds across a wide dynamic range and supports the hearing of both delicate and powerful sounds, all while preserving the information needed for pitch, timing, and intensity. Another remarkable feature of the cochlea is that it is not entirely passive. For many years, one might have imagined it simply as a fluid-filled receiver waiting for waves to arrive. But the inner ear actively sharpens and enhances its own responses, largely through the work of outer hair cells, which we will discuss properly in the next stage of the journey. These cells can change length in response to stimulation and feed energy back into the motion of the basilar membrane, effectively amplifying certain responses and improving frequency selectivity. This means the cochlea is not just a place where sound gets translated. It is a place where sound is refined. It tunes itself. It boosts what matters. It improves resolution. The ear, as usual, turns out to be less like a dead mechanical recorder and more like a living participant. That living quality is important because hearing is not only about detecting that a sound exists, it is about distinguishing one sound from another with enough precision to understand speech, enjoy music, notice tone, detect approach, and navigate environments. The cochlea lays the groundwork for all of this by taking a complex wave and beginning the separation of its ingredients. It is here that the physical differences between low and high frequencies become organized spatially. It is here that small movements are translated into cellular events. It is here that the first proper sensory encoding of sound begins. Because the cochlea is buried so deep and works so quietly, it can be difficult to appreciate how continuously it labours. Every sound you hear reaches it. Every word of a conversation, every passing truck, every page turned, every spoon set down, every small household click in the evening. The stapes moves, pressure enters, the fluid wave travels, the basilar membrane responds, the organ of Corti reacts, over and over, second after second. You do not monitor any of it consciously, you simply hear. But hearing rests on this persistent hidden movement. There is also something almost architectural about the cochlea's logic. The base is tuned for high frequencies, the apex is tuned for low frequencies, the chambers are partitioned, the fluids differ. The windows at either end allow pressure to move meaningfully through the structure. The sensory cells sit in a highly organised arrangement along the length of the organ. Nothing is random. Every part contributes to the transformation of vibration into signal. And because that transformation begins with mechanical sorting, the cochlea stands as one of the clearest examples of the body solving a complex information problem with physical design. Perhaps that is one of the gentlest revelations in anatomy. We often imagine intelligence only in the brain, but the senses are full of cleverness long before signals reach conscious thought. The eye separates wavelengths and focuses light. The nose exposes molecules to receptors through controlled airflow. The skin arranges different receptor types in different tissues, and the cochlea, deep in its spiral shell, sorts frequencies and magnifies subtle differences before the brain has said a word about any of it. The body is thoughtful in its structure. It meets the world halfway. Of course, none of this would amount to hearing in the fullest sense unless the motion in the cochlea could be turned into electrical language the kind nerves can carry. Pressure waves in fluid are still only motion. A frequency map along the basilar membrane is still only movement in space. At some point, specialized cells must respond in a way that opens the door to signaling. That is where the hair cells become central. They are the true sensory agents of the cochlea, and their tiny bending structures are about to take the flowing mechanical story and turn it into something the auditory nerve can send onward to the brain. So the cochlea is the spiral threshold, the hidden analyzer, the place where incoming vibration is sorted, guided, and prepared for conversion. It receives the push passed through the middle ear and turns that push into travelling patterns within a fluid-filled world. It organises those patterns by pitch. It places them along a map. It sets the stage for one of the most delicate transformations in the body. And resting on that stage are rows of cells so specialised that the slightest movement in the right place can change the entire signal, because the next part of hearing belongs to those cells and to the way the ear separates pitch from noise with microscopic precision. By the time sound reaches this point in the journey, it has already travelled a remarkable distance in form as well as in space. It began as movement out in the world, passed through air, entered the outer ear, vibrated the eardrum, crossed the tiny lever system of the middle ear, and sent a pressure wave into the fluid-filled spiral of the cochlea. That alone would be a satisfying piece of engineering. But the cochlea is not just carrying vibration onward like a polite hallway. It is doing something much more interesting. It is beginning to sort sound. It is beginning to decide where different frequencies belong. And at the centre of that task are some of the most delicate and specialised cells in the body, the hair cells, whose name sounds almost disappointingly ordinary until you see what they actually do. They are not hairs in the familiar sense. Nothing here is growing out of the skin waiting to be brushed. The name comes from the tiny hair-like projections that rise from the tops of these cells. These projections are called stereocelia, and they are the true mechanical sensors of hearing. They stand in neatly organised bundles, and when the structures around them move in the right way, those bundles bend. That bending is the key event. It is the tiny motion that allows the ear to take physical vibration and begin turning it into electrical information. In a sense, the whole story of hearing has been leading toward this gesture. Air moved a membrane. Bones moved fluid. Fluid moved membranes inside the cochlea. And now, finally, the movement reaches cells that can answer it in the language of the nervous system. These hair cells sit within the organ of Corti, which rests on the basilar membrane running through the cochlea. The basilar membrane, as we have just seen, is not the same from base to apex. It is narrower and stiffer near the base, and wider and more flexible toward the apex. That changing structure matters because different frequencies cause the greatest movement in different places along it. High-frequency sounds affect the base more strongly. Low-frequency sounds travel farther and peak closer to the apex. This means the cochlea is arranged like a long-frequency map. Each place along it is more responsive to certain pitches than others. The hair cells sitting in those places inherit that tuning. They are not all hearing the same thing equally. Their location helps determine what they are best at detecting. This is how the ear begins separating pitch from the general wash of vibration. A sound enters the cochlea, and the wave travelling through the fluid causes the basilar membrane to move most strongly at some places more than others, depending on the frequencies involved. If the sound is high, the strongest movement happens closer to the base. If it is low, the action happens farther along the spiral. A complex sound containing many frequencies creates a more distributed pattern. The cochlea, then, is not responding as one uniform chamber. It is analysing, it is sorting, it is turning the smooth arrival of sound into a spatial pattern of activity. That pattern is the beginning of pitch perception, in a very real physical sense. And yet the hair cells do more than simply sit there and wait to be bent. There are two main types of them, and although both are called hair cells, they have different roles. There are inner hair cells and outer hair cells. The inner hair cells are the primary sensory messengers. They are the ones that send most of the information onward to the auditory nerve. The outer hair cells, by contrast, are part of a remarkable feedback system that sharpens and amplifies the mechanical response of the cochlea itself. This distinction is one of the great delights of ear anatomy, because it reveals once again that the body is more inventive than a simple diagram suggests. One set of cells mainly reports the sound. Another set helps tune the instrument while it is being played. The inner hair cells sit in a single row along the cochlea, while the outer hair cells are arranged in 3 rows. That alone gives a hint that the system is doing something more elaborate than one might first assume. The inner hair cells, though fewer, are the real gateways to sensation. When the right movement bends their stereocilia, special channels open at the tips, ions move into the cells, the electrical state of the cells changes, a neurotransmitter is released onto the nerve fibres waiting below. That is the moment when the mechanical story becomes unmistakably neural. The hair cell is not firing like a neuron itself, but it is converting motion into a signal that excites the auditory nerve. At last, the world's vibration has become something that can travel toward the brain. The bending of the stereocilia is exquisitely small. That is worth dwelling on because hearing often feels broad and effortless. A room hums, a voice speaks, a kettle starts to sing, and it all seems natural enough. But down at the level of the hair cell, the physical movements can be minute beyond ordinary imagination. Tiny displacements are enough. The stereocilia are connected by fine structures sometimes called tip links, and when the bundle bends in one direction, tension on those links helps open mechanically sensitive channels. When the bundle bends back, the channels close again. This means the cells are not just chemically responsive in some vague way, they are mechanically gated. They open because they are bent. It is a beautifully direct piece of sensory design. There is something very satisfying about how literal that is. Sound moves the world. The ear captures that movement, the cochlea sorts it, the hair cells bend, signal begins. The whole process stays true to the physical nature of sound without ever losing sensitivity. It does not cheat by skipping straight to meaning. It proceeds honestly, step by step, until the nervous system has something it can work with. The outer hair cells add another layer of sophistication. These cells can change length when stimulated. That means they do not merely respond to movement. They feed mechanical energy back into the basilar membrane. This active process sharpens the cochlea's tuning and boosts weak sounds. It is sometimes called the cochlea amplifier. Without it, hearing would be less sensitive and less selective. Different frequencies would blur more into one another. Speech would be harder to separate in noisy environments. Fine distinctions in pitch would suffer. In other words, the outer hair cells help the cochlea behave less like a passive receiving surface and more like a living, adjustable instrument. This matters enormously because the world is rarely acoustically neat. If every sound arrived alone in a quiet room, hearing would be easy. But that is not how life behaves. Voices overlap, rooms echo, traffic drones beneath conversation. Wind and movement and machinery add layers of acoustic clutter. The ear needs ways to separate useful patterns from general noise, and one of the first places that happens is here, in the mechanical and cellular precision of the cochlea. by sharply tuning different regions to different frequencies, and by using the outer hair cells to refine that tuning further, the ear begins to disentangle complexity almost immediately. That helps explain why pitch is not just a mental label we attach later. Pitch begins as a pattern in the ear itself. A high note on a violin, a low hum from an engine, the middle frequencies of spoken vowels, the crisp higher frequency edges of consonants, all of these excite different regions of the cochlea in different ways. Even before the brain decides what the sound is, the ear has already distributed the frequencies along its spiral map. The auditory nerve will later carry that map forward, but the sorting starts here. Noise becomes especially interesting in this context. In everyday speech, noise often means any unwanted sound. In hearing science, it can also mean a sound with a broad mix of frequencies rather than a clean, stable pitch. A hiss, for instance, spreads energy across a wide range. A pure tone is much simpler, concentrating energy more narrowly. The cochlea responds differently to these patterns. A pure tone produces a more focused area of peak activity. Broad noise excites a larger spread of the cochlea. The ear therefore has a physical basis for distinguishing a note from a hiss, a voice from static, a musical tone from the roughness of a busy room. It is not that noise is meaningless and pitch is meaningful. Rather, they create different activity patterns, and those differences help the nervous system make sense of the acoustic scene. Speech depends heavily on this ability. Human language is not made of simple pure tones. It is a moving blend of frequencies, shaped by the vocal tract changing from moment to moment. Vowels carry strong resonant bands. Consonants often depend on quick bursts, friction, or high-frequency details. To understand speech, the ear must preserve those spectral differences well enough for the next stages of the system to recognize patterns. If the cochlea's tuning is damaged or broadened, speech can become muddy, especially in noise. A person may still hear that someone is speaking, but the sharpness that separates one consonant from another may be diminished. It is one reason people with inner ear damage often say not merely that sound is too quiet, but that it is unclear. The outer hair cells are especially important in that clarity. Because they help sharpen frequency selectivity, they contribute to our ability to distinguish nearby pitches and subtle spectral contrasts. When they are damaged, as often happens with loud noise exposure or aging, hearing may become less sensitive and less precise at the same time. Sounds may need to be louder to be heard, but even when they are made louder, they may not sound clean. That is because the problem is not just volume, it is resolution. The ear's fine filter has been compromised. This is a point worth lingering on because it helps explain something many people find frustrating. Someone may say they can hear that others are talking but cannot make out the words, especially in a restaurant, a family gathering, or a room with background noise. That experience often reflects the loss of the ear's ability to separate signal from clutter effectively. The cochlea is no longer carving the acoustic world into fine enough pieces. The brain receives a blurrier pattern and has to work harder, often with less success. Hearing, then, is not only about detecting sound, it is about separating structure from confusion. The timing of hair cell responses matters too. For lower frequencies especially, the auditory system can preserve information about the timing of the wave itself. The hair cells and auditory nerve can reflect when in the cycle a sound is occurring, not just where along the cochlea it is strongest. This helps the system represent pitch in more than one way. Place along the basilar membrane tells part of the story. Timing in the neural response tells another part, especially for lower frequencies. The ear, as ever, prefers not to rely on only one clue when two will do a better job. Still, the placemap remains one of the most elegant features of the cochlea. Imagine a keyboard curled into a spiral, with different regions tuned to different notes, except that the keys are living tissue, and the pressing happens through pressure waves in fluid. That's not a perfect image, but it gives a sense of what the cochlea is achieving. It is laying out sound across space. It is turning frequency into location. Then the hair cells at those locations translate the movement into electrical patterns. Hearing begins to become organised information. All of this depends on the health of the hair cells, and those cells are precious because in humans they do not readily regenerate once lost. Birds and some other animals can replace damaged hair cells. Humans, unfortunately, do not have that gift in any useful way. This is why damage from excessive noise can be lasting. A loud concert, industrial exposure, unsafe headphone volume, explosive sounds, repeated occupational noise, all can injure these cells or their delicate stereocilia. Sometimes the result is temporary threshold shift, where hearing seems muffled for a while and recovers. Sometimes the damage is permanent, leaving reduced sensitivity, poorer frequency discrimination, and often tinnitus, that phantom ringing or buzzing which can linger because the injured system is no longer signalling normally. This fragility gives the hair cells a slightly tragic dignity. They're brilliant at what they do, but they are not endlessly replaceable. Their tiny bundles bend thousands upon thousands of times a day in faithful service, and yet too much force can injure them. The same structures that allow exquisite sensitivity also create vulnerability. Biology often works that way. Precision has a price. Even when healthy, the hair cells are not simply on or off. Their responses can vary with intensity. Soft sounds create one level of receptor response. Stronger sounds create larger responses up to a point. The outer hair cells help broaden the useful range by boosting small inputs more than large ones, making the system especially sensitive to faint sounds without losing all capacity for louder ones. This contributes to the tremendous dynamic range of hearing. We can notice very soft sounds, yet still tolerate much louder ones, at least within reason. The ear is not doing this with a single blunt mechanism. It is managing sensitivity actively and selectively. There is also something beautiful in how local this all is. No cell needs to know the whole sound. A hair cell responds to the movement occurring at its position along the cochlea. That local response, combined with the responses of many neighbouring and distant cells, creates the broader pattern the auditory nerve will carry onward. Each cell contributes a tiny piece of the acoustic picture. Together they form an organised representation of the sound. Hearing is collective work, even at the cellular level. Music makes this especially lovely to imagine. A chord enters the ear. Different frequencies peak in different places. Hair cells along multiple parts of the cochlea respond. Some regions represent the low foundational tones, others the middle harmonies, others the bright upper overtones that give the sound its character. The ear is already unpacking the chord before the brain has recognized it as major, minor, warm, tense, or familiar. Likewise in speech, the resonant patterns of a voice distribute themselves across the spiral. The ear is preparing the raw material from which identity, emotion, and language will later emerge. And of course the world rarely offers single isolated sounds. Most of the time many frequencies arrive together, overlapping in time and space. The cochlea does not panic. It lays them out. It lets different regions respond according to their tuning. It sharpens the contrasts as best it can. It transforms movement into neural evidence. This is how pitch begins to stand out from noise, not by magic, but by structure. The ear has built-in ways of separating the smooth from the rough, the narrow from the broad, the tuned from the scattered. Soon, though, those patterns have to leave the cochlea. The hair cells can convert motion into changes in neurotransmitter release, but they do not send the information to consciousness directly. Waiting at their base are the fibres of the auditory nerve, ready to carry this newly encoded map of sound deeper into the nervous system. That next handoff is crucial, because once the hair cells have done their bending and translating, the message must travel onward at speed, preserving pitch, timing and intensity well enough for everything farther up the pathway to keep building the experience of hearing. By the time sound reaches the auditory nerve, it is no longer really sound in the ordinary sense. It has already passed through too many translations for that. It began as motion in the world, entered the outer ear, moved the eardrum, crossed the tiny bones of the middle ear, pushed into the fluid of the cochlea, and bent the stereocilia of the hair cells. That bending opened the door to electrical change, and now, at last, the message is ready to leave the ear itself and begin its journey into the nervous system. This is the point where hearing stops being only a local event inside a hidden spiral and becomes a travelling signal. The auditory nerve is the route out. It is the line along which the ear hands its carefully sorted information to the brain. That handoff is more important than it may first seem. The cochlea has done an astonishing amount of work already. It has separated frequencies by place, sharpened responses with the help of outer hair cells, and let inner hair cells convert mechanical movement into changes in neurotransmitter release. But none of that matters very much unless the information can now be carried onward faithfully. The auditory nerve is not just a cable that says, yes, something happened. It has to preserve timing, pitch, and intensity with enough precision that everything farther along the pathway can continue building the experience of hearing. In other words, the nerve does not merely report that the ear was busy. It carries a structured account of what kind of sound arrived. The cells that give rise to the auditory nerve are called spiral ganglion neurons. Their name comes from the fact that their cell bodies sit in a spiral arrangement within the cochlea, following its coiled shape. Each of these neurons connects in one direction to the hair cells of the organ of Corti, and in the other direction to nerve fibres that bundle together and leave the inner ear. These fibres form the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is the 8th cranial nerve. That name sounds a bit grand and perhaps slightly overcommitted, but it is accurate. This cranial nerve has two major parts. One part carries hearing information from the cochlea. The other carries balance information from the vestibular organs nearby. The ear, as it turns out, is a rather efficient neighbour. Hearing and equilibrium live side by side and even share the same general highway out of the inner ear. Before the message enters that highway, though, it begins in a very local and intimate way at the base of the inner hair cells. These hair cells are the main sensory cells of hearing. When their stereocilia bend in the right direction, mechanically sensitive channels open, ions enter, the electrical state of the hair cell changes, a neurotransmitter is released onto the endings of the spiral ganglion neurons. That neurotransmitter is usually glutamate, which is one of the nervous system's main excitatory messengers. The hair cell does not send long-distance impulses itself. Instead, it speaks chemically to the nerve fibre waiting below. If the stimulation is strong enough, that nerve fibre generates action potentials, the electrical spikes that travel along neurons and carry information over distance. This is a significant moment in the hearing story. Up to now, the system has relied heavily on mechanical events. Membranes moved, bones leveraged motion, fluid waves travelled, hair bundles bent. Those things are still very much part of what hearing is, but once the auditory nerve begins firing, the signal has entered the language of the nervous system proper. It can now travel rapidly, repeatedly, and in organised patterns toward the brain stem. The ear has done its translation, and the nerve takes over as messenger. What is remarkable is how many nerve fibres are involved and how specifically they are connected. In general, a single inner hair cell can communicate with many auditory nerve fibres, while each auditory nerve fibre usually receives input from just one inner hair cell. That arrangement tells you something important. The system wants detailed reporting. It does not want one broad nerve line vaguely summarising the neighbourhood. It wants multiple listeners attached to the same local source, each ready to respond under slightly different conditions. Some fibres are especially sensitive and fire at low sound levels. Others require stronger stimulation and come into play at higher levels. This helps the auditory system represent a wide range of intensities without becoming too blunt or too easily saturated. That is part of how loudness begins to be encoded in the nerve. As sound grows stronger, some fibres fire faster, and additional fibres with higher thresholds may join in. The result is not one simple knob labelled volume. It is a population response, a changing pattern across many nerve fibres. The brain later interprets that pattern as loudness, but the groundwork begins here in the auditory nerve's firing behaviour. Pitch information is also preserved. Because different places along the cochlea respond best to different frequencies, the auditory nerve fibres connected to those places inherit that tuning. Fibres from the base of the cochlea tend to carry higher frequency information. Fibres from the apex tend to carry lower frequency information. This means the nerve maintains the tonotopic map established by the basilar membrane. The pathway out of the ear is not a scrambled bundle where all pitch information gets thrown together like socks in a laundry basket. It is ordered. The layout of frequency is kept intact. That order will continue into the brainstem and beyond. Timing matters just as much. Hearing is not only about which frequencies are present, but also about when things happen. Speech depends on timing. Music certainly depends on timing. So does the ability to locate sounds, because the brain compares tiny differences in arrival time between the two ears. The auditory nerve must therefore preserve fine temporal detail, especially for lower frequencies where phase locking can occur. This means that nerve fibres tend to fire at particular points in the cycle of a sound wave, not at random. They do not necessarily fire on every single cycle, especially at higher frequencies, but their firing is still tied to the timing structure of the sound. That temporal fidelity is one of the reasons the auditory system can be so precise. It is helpful to imagine the auditory nerve not as a single line, but as a busy stream of coordinated reports. One group of fibres signals activity from a region tuned to a certain pitch. Another group signals a neighbouring pitch. Some fire more vigorously as intensity rises. Others preserve timing patterns. All of them together create a richly structured account of what the cochlea has detected. The signal leaving the ear is already far more informative than a simple yes or no. The nerve fibres themselves are myelinated, which helps the electrical impulses travel quickly and efficiently. Myelin is the insulating sheath that wraps many nerve fibres in the nervous system and allows rapid conduction. This matters because hearing is a fast sense. There is not much room for leisurely delivery. A delayed sound signal would be useless for timing comparisons and clumsy for speech processing. The auditory system depends on speed and precision, and myelination helps provide both. The action potentials move along the fibres toward the brainstem through the internal acoustic meatus, a canal in the temporal bone that also carries the vestibular nerve and the facial nerve. It is a fairly busy little route, which makes the skull seem almost like a building with very efficient service tunnels hidden inside the walls. As the auditory nerve leaves the cochlea, it carries information from one ear only. That may sound obvious, but it leads to something interesting. Very early in the brainstem, the pathways from the two ears begin to interact. This is how the brain eventually compares sound arriving from left and right. But at the level of the auditory nerve itself, the message is still ear-specific. The right auditory nerve reports the right cochlea. The left auditory nerve reports the left cochlea. This separate reporting is crucial because the differences between the two sides are what allow location cues to be computed later on. One of the more fascinating details about auditory nerve fibres is that they often have spontaneous activity even in the absence of obvious sound. In other words, they are not perfectly silent until the world makes a noise. Many fibres fire at a baseline rate, and sound changes that rate and pattern. This can make the system very responsive because it does not always have to start from absolute zero. It is already idling, ready to be shifted upward or otherwise modulated by incoming stimulation. Like many biological systems, it prefers readiness to total stillness. Of course, all this faithful signalling depends on healthy connections between hair cells and nerve fibres. If the hair cells are damaged, the nerve receives poorer input. But there can also be problems at the synapse itself or within the nerve even when the outer and middle ear seem fine. One example is auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, in which sound may reach the inner ear, but the timing or synchrony of nerve firing is disrupted. A person may hear that sounds exist, yet struggle terribly to understand speech, especially in noise. because the signal leaving the ear is not coordinated well enough. This reveals something important. Good hearing is not merely about sound getting in, it is also about the nerve carrying it in an organised way. There are also tumours called vestibular schwannomas, sometimes called acoustic neuromas, though they usually arise from the vestibular portion of the eighth nerve rather than the cochlear part. Even so, because of their location, they can affect hearing, often causing gradual hearing loss, tinnitus, or balance symptoms on one side. That is another reminder that the auditory nerve travels in close company with balance-related fibres. The geography of the inner ear is compact. Hearing and equilibrium are neighbours whether one thinks about them or not. Still, in ordinary healthy hearing, the auditory nerve performs its work so smoothly that it disappears from awareness. Nobody sits in a room and says, "What a lovely evening. My spiral ganglion neurons seem to be firing beautifully tonight." One simply hears. A voice enters the ear and appears in awareness almost immediately. A bird calls, a glass clinks, a page turns. The pathway from hair cell to nerve fibre to brainstem is so reliable that the mind experiences the result as direct contact with the world. Yet the directness is an illusion produced by speed. There is always a route, always a relay, always this hidden bundle of fibres carrying coded electrical spikes into the central nervous system. What those spikes represent is not a finished sound. That is an important distinction. The auditory nerve does not carry meaning in the way the conscious mind knows meaning. It carries structured evidence, frequencies here, intensities there, timing patterns preserved, the map of the cochlea maintained. It does not know whether the sound is a friend's voice, a violin, a kettle, or rain against the window. It knows only what the ear has encoded. It is a disciplined courier, not an interpreter. And yet, it must be an excellent courier, because the data it carries are the raw materials from which all later hearing is built. If pitch information is blurred here, later processing starts with a disadvantage. If timing is imprecise here, localization and speech perception both suffer. If intensity coding is distorted here, loudness becomes harder to judge properly. Every later auditory centre depends on the fidelity of this early transmission. In that sense, the auditory nerve is not just another step in the chain. It is the bridge between sensation and central processing. It is also one of the clearest examples of how the nervous system values organisation. The cochlea has already arranged frequencies by place, and the nerve keeps that arrangement. Lower frequency fibres arise from one end, higher frequency fibres from another. This orderly layout, or tonotopy, continues into the cochlear nuclei in the brainstem, then into higher centres beyond. The system does not casually abandon useful structure once it has established it. It carries it forward. That allows later parts of the brain to work with a sound map that remains consistent from the ear inward. Another quietly astonishing thing about the auditory nerve is the sheer speed with which it allows hearing to happen. By the time you consciously notice a sound, multiple steps have already occurred. Hair cells have bent, neurotransmitter has been released, nerve fibres have fired, the signal has entered the brainstem, and further processing has begun. All of this happens so quickly that consciousness receives a unified event rather than a sequence. We hear the world as present. We do not feel the relay stations. Biology hides its paperwork very well. The nerve's relationship with the cochlea also helps explain why some hearing losses are more subtle than others. A person may pass a simple hearing check for volume, but still struggle in complicated listening situations if the nerve's timing or synchrony is off. This is because hearing is not just about detecting a beep in a quiet booth. It is about carrying richly patterned signals well enough for the brain to sort voices from background noise, track speech across time, notice consonants, and compare the two ears accurately. The auditory nerve is central to all of that. It is where the detailed cochlear analysis first becomes a travelling neural report. There is something a little comforting about how methodical this all is. The ear does not fling sound at the brain and hope for the best. It prepares a measured account. The nerve does not improvise wildly. It carries what it has been given with impressive fidelity. The whole arrangement suggests a system built less on drama than on reliability. Sound reaches the cochlea organises it, the auditory nerve carries it onward. Again and again, hour after hour, across a lifetime of voices, footsteps, storms, songs, traffic, laughter, machines, whispers, and all the unremarkable sounds that quietly fill human days. And still, even as the auditory nerve rushes its signals toward the brainstem, it does not travel alone. It runs beside fibres from another system in the same inner ear, a system not concerned with pitch or loudness at all, but with head movement, position, and balance. The two systems share the same general neighbourhood because the inner ear is responsible for more than hearing. It is also part of how you stay upright, steady, and oriented while moving through the world. So just as sound is leaving the ear and entering the brain, it is worth turning slightly to the side and noticing the structures next door, because hearing and equilibrium have been living together all along. If someone told you that the structures helping you hear a whisper are living right beside the structures helping you stand upright without tipping over, it might sound like one of those slightly suspicious facts biology likes to spring on people when it feels underappreciated. And yet, that is exactly the arrangement. Deep inside the temporal bone, hidden well beyond the visible ear and the moving bones of the middle ear, the inner ear houses both the cochlea for hearing and the vestibular system for balance. One helps you detect vibration and turn it into sound. The other helps you detect motion, gravity, and changes in head position, so that the rest of your body knows which way is up, and whether you're moving, turning, tilting, rising, or stopping. These systems do different jobs, but they live side by side, share fluid-filled spaces, and travel together out of the skull through the same cranial nerve. It is a remarkably economical arrangement. Nature, as usual, seems to have rented one hidden suite in the bone and moved in two very different departments. At first glance, hearing and balance do not seem especially related. One gives you music, speech, warning sounds, and the soft noise of rain against the window. The other keeps you from walking into a doorway when you turn too quickly, and helps your eyes stay steady while your head is moving. One feels like perception. The other often feels invisible until something goes wrong, but underneath that difference is a shared idea. Both systems are trying to detect movement. Hearing detects rapid vibrations, the kind that occur as sound waves. Balance detects slower mechanical changes, the kind produced by head motion, acceleration, and gravity. In both cases, the inner ear is using specialized cells to convert movement into nerve signals. The cochlea listens to vibration. The vestibular organs listen to motion of a different kind. They are cousins in both structure and purpose. The vestibular part of the inner ear includes the semicircular canals and two pouch-like organs called the utricle and saccule. Together, these structures detect angular motion, linear acceleration, and head position relative to gravity. All of them are fluid-filled and lined with sensory regions that contain hair cells, just as the cochlea does. That is one of the first clues that hearing and balance belong to the same anatomical family. Once again, there are hair cells with stereocilia that bend when movement occurs. Once again, mechanical force becomes electrical information. The details differ, of course, because the kind of movement being measured is not the same, but the basic principle is familiar. The inner ear is a master of turning motion into signal. The semicircular canals are perhaps the most visually distinctive part of the vestibular system. There are 3 of them in each ear, arranged at roughly right angles to one another. This allows them to detect rotation of the head in different planes. If you shake your head no, nod yes, or tilt it toward the shoulder, different canals become involved. Each canal is filled with fluid called endolymph and has an enlarged area at one end called the ampulla. Inside the ampulla is a sensory structure with hair cells embedded in a gelatinous mass called the cupula. When the head rotates, the bony canal moves with it, but the fluid lags slightly behind because of inertia. That lag bends the cupula and the hair cells within it. The hair cells respond, nerve signals are generated, and the brain receives information that the head is turning. This is one of those mechanisms that sounds slightly overcomplicated until you realise how useful it is. Every time you turn your head, your eyes need to stay oriented to the world. If they did not, the visual scene would smear every time you looked around. The vestibular system helps prevent that through reflexes that connect inner ear signals to the eye muscles. This is called the vestibulo-ocular reflex, and it is one of the most efficient bits of behind-the-scenes biology in the body. Turn your head to the right, and your eyes automatically move to the left, just enough to keep your gaze steady. You do not ask them to do this. They simply do it. That means the balance organs are constantly assisting vision, which is perhaps why the body put them so near the auditory system in the first place. The head is a busy region. It helps to keep the service departments close together. The utricle and saccule handle a different task. They detect linear acceleration and head position relative to gravity. If you accelerate in a car, slow down suddenly, rise in an elevator, or tilt your head while lying in bed, these organs are involved. Their sensory regions are called maculae, and their hair cells are embedded in a gelatinous layer topped with tiny calcium carbonate crystals called otoconia. These crystals add weight. Gravity and acceleration pull on them, and that pull shifts the gelatinous layer, bending the hair cells beneath. The result is a signal telling the brain about tilt and straight line motion. If the semicircular canals are the rotation detectors, the utricle and saccule are the organs that say, we are leaning, we are rising, we are moving forward, we have just stopped more suddenly than anyone would prefer. There is something slightly amusing about the fact that your sense of uprightness depends in part on tiny crystals sliding across gelatin inside the skull. It sounds less like anatomy, and more like a household dessert in mild distress. But it works beautifully most of the time. Those crystals make gravity measurable to the nervous system. Without them, the brain would have far less direct information about head tilt and linear movement. The vestibular organs therefore provide a constant stream of orientation data that helps coordinate posture, eye movements, and bodily stability. So why do hearing and balance live together? The first answer is developmental and structural. They arise from related embryological origins and use similar sensory strategies. Both are built around hair cells responding to mechanical deflection. Both operate in fluid-filled chambers within the inner ear. Both send their information to the brain through branches of the same cranial nerve. The eighth cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, includes one branch for hearing and one for balance. This is not a coincidence. The inner ear is a specialized mechanical sensor package, and both hearing and equilibrium are part of that package. One detects high-speed vibrations from the outer world. The other detects the body's own movement through space. The second answer is practical. The head is where these senses are most useful. Hearing works best when the receiving structures are close to the face and the brain. Balance information about head movement is especially valuable because the head contains the eyes, and eye stability is essential for functioning in a moving world. If the vestibular organs were somewhere less directly tied to the head, the timing and usefulness of their signals would be reduced. Keeping these systems together means that sound detection, head motion detection, and the control of gaze all happen in close coordination. It is efficient, and biology has always had a soft spot for efficiency when it can manage it. This shared neighbourhood also explains why problems in the inner ear can sometimes affect both hearing and balance. If an infection, inflammation, trauma, or disease strikes the labyrinth of the inner ear, symptoms may include hearing loss, tinnitus, dizziness, imbalance, or vertigo. The word labyrinth is fitting, by the way. The inner ear is often called the bony labyrinth and membranous labyrinth because of its complex arrangement of chambers and canals. It is a real maze in there, though mercifully one you are not expected to navigate personally. When the system is healthy, this complexity is a triumph. When it is disturbed, the results can be deeply unpleasant because both hearing and equilibrium may be drawn into the trouble. Vertigo is a particularly vivid example of balance gone wrong. It is not just feeling a bit lightheaded or off. Vertigo is the false sensation of movement, often spinning, caused by a mismatch or disturbance in the balance system. A person may feel the room turning, or feel themselves turning when they are perfectly still. Nausea often joins the party because the brain is receiving signals that suggest motion, while the eyes or body may disagree. The reason this feels so dramatic is that the vestibular system is usually so reliable that when it fails, the rest of the brain reacts with understandable alarm. Stability is something we rarely appreciate until the floor seems to have developed opinions of its own. One common cause of vertigo is benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, or BPPV, which occurs when some of those tiny crystals from the utricle become displaced and enter one of the semicircular canals. Then, when the head changes position, the crystals move inappropriately within the canal and create misleading signals about rotation. The person turns over in bed or looks upward, and suddenly the world spins. This is an elegant example of how closely the balance organs depend on the proper placement of their mechanical components. A few crystals in the wrong place, and the system begins telling a very unconvincing but very persuasive story. Another condition, Meniere's disease, can affect both hearing and balance, often causing episodes of vertigo, fluctuating hearing loss, tinnitus, and a feeling of pressure in the ear. The exact mechanisms can vary and are still not fully settled, but abnormal fluid regulation within the inner ear is thought to play a role. Again, it is the shared environment of hearing and balance that explains the mixed symptoms. If the inner ear's fluid systems are disturbed, both the cochlear and vestibular structures may suffer. One part of the person hears poorly or hears ringing. Another part feels movement that is not there. The result can be deeply disorienting. Even more ordinary experiences reveal the partnership between these systems. Think about riding a merry-go-round as a child, or perhaps unwisely deciding to spin in an office chair for scientific reasons. When the spinning stops, the sensation of motion may continue for a while. That is because the fluid in the semicircular canals keeps moving briefly after the head stops, continuing to bend the sensory structures and telling the brain that rotation is still happening. The eyes may show characteristic flicking movements called nystagmus, as the vestibular system and visual system argue politely but urgently about what is going on. Eventually the fluid settles, the signal calms, and dignity may or may not return. Hearing itself usually continues during all of this, which makes the distinction between the two systems clear even though they are neighbours. A spinning person can still hear a friend laughing at the consequences. The cochlea is doing its own job while the balance organs are trying to recover their composure. But because the systems are close together and share nerve pathways near their origin, the medical story of one often involves the other. An inner ear disorder is rarely discussed without someone asking, quite reasonably, whether hearing or balance has been affected, or both. There is another important point here, and it has to do with how balance is never handled by the inner ear alone. The vestibular organs provide crucial information, but the brain combines that information with visual input and with proprioception, which is the sense of where your limbs and body are in space. Balance is really a collaboration between the inner ear, the eyes, muscles, joints, and brain. That is why standing on one leg becomes harder with the eyes closed. You have removed one important source of orientation, so the system leans more heavily on the others. The inner ear is still working, but it is part of a team. Hearing is collaborative too, though in a different way. The cochlea sends information onward, but the brain has to interpret it. The vestibular organs send information onward, but the brain has to integrate it with vision and posture. The inner ear, then, is not the whole story in either case. It is a sophisticated sensor array feeding the central nervous system with richly organized data. The brain makes use of that data in different ways. One pathway becomes conscious sound, another becomes stability, gaze control, and the ability to move through the world without falling over every time you look at something interesting. The hair cells of the vestibular system deserve a bit more attention because they reveal both the similarity and the difference between hearing and balance. Like the cochlea hair cells, they have bundles of stereocilia and a taller structure called a kinocilium in vestibular organs. When the bundle bends toward the kinocilium, the cell becomes more excited. When it bends away, the activity decreases. This directional sensitivity is useful because it allows the system to encode the direction of movement, not just the fact that movement happened. In the semicircular canals, different orientations of the canals mean different rotations can be detected. In the utricle and saccule, the arrangement of the hair cells helps encode different directions of tilt and acceleration. Once again, the system is not satisfied with a vague report. It wants organized detail. There is also a lovely efficiency in the way vestibular information reaches the eye muscles so quickly. The vestibulo-ocular reflex is fast enough to stabilize vision during head movement without waiting for conscious perception. You do not first realize that your head is turning and then decide to move your eyes in compensation. The reflex is already at work. That speed is essential. If it were slow, the visual world would blur and lag every time you walked or nodded. Hearing has its own fast routes and timing demands, of course, but balance feels especially invisible because so much of its processing stays beneath awareness unless something unusual happens. When something unusual does happen, the partnership between hearing and balance becomes easier to appreciate. Consider how dizziness can make the world feel acoustically strange too, even when hearing remains technically intact. A spinning room makes every sound seem oddly detached from its source because spatial orientation is compromised. Or consider how a severe unilateral hearing loss can slightly alter a person's sense of space because one side of the head is no longer providing the same auditory cues. The systems are separate, but they both contribute to how you inhabit the world around you. One tells you what is sounding, the other helps tell you where you are while it sounds. This shared role in spatial experience may be one reason the inner ear feels so central to ordinary life despite being almost entirely hidden. You walk, turn, listen, focus on a face, hear a voice from behind you, keep your gaze steady as you cross the room, adjust posture when the floor slopes slightly, and all the while the cochlea and vestibular organs are feeding information forward. The body does not ask you to supervise any of it, it simply does the work. Hidden systems often seem almost generous that way. Of course, the hearing pathway will continue upward from here without needing the balance organs to explain speech or recognize melody, and the vestibular pathway will continue in ways that help posture, eye movements, and orientation without needing the cochlea to detect a kettle beginning to whistle. But tonight it is worth enjoying the fact that they live side by side and that both depend on the inner ear's talent for converting motion into meaningfully organized nerve signals. One inner ear helps you hear the world, the other, folded into the same hidden architecture, helps you stay steady enough to move through it. And when the auditory branch leaves this neighborhood behind and climbs farther into the brain, the real act of hearing is still not finished. The ear has done a remarkable amount already. It has gathered sound, transmitted it, amplified it, sorted it by frequency, converted it into neural signals, and handed those signals onward. But hearing, in the fullest sense, does not happen in the ear alone. Not yet. A sound is not truly a voice, a word, a direction, a memory, or a meaning until the brain begins doing its own quiet work with what the ear has sent. By the time sound reaches the brain, the ear has already done an extraordinary amount of work. The outer ear gathered the wave, the eardrum received it, the ossicles carried it, the cochlea separated it by frequency, the hair cells translated movement into electrical change, the auditory nerve sent organized signals inward with all the loyalty of a courier who knows the package is important and has no intention of dropping it in a puddle. And yet, even after all of that, hearing is still not complete. Detecting sound is not the same as understanding it. A pattern of nerve activity is not yet a voice, a warning, a familiar melody, a friend in the next room, or the difference between a kettle and rain. The brain hears last because the brain is where sound finally becomes meaning. This is one of the strangest things about the senses. We talk as though we hear with the ears, and of course in one sense we do. Without the ears, there is no useful signal to send onward, but the ears do not know language. They do not recognize the sound of your own name. They do not notice that one laugh is affectionate and another is forced. They do not understand that a certain song belonged to a certain year of your life, or that footsteps on the stairs at midnight carry a different emotional tone than footsteps at noon. The ears deliver structure. The brain turns structure into the lived experience of hearing. The auditory nerve first enters the brainstem, where the signal reaches a group of structures called the cochlea nuclei. These are the first central stations in the auditory pathway, and they do not merely receive the message and pass it along unchanged. They begin analysing it in different ways. Some neurons are especially sensitive to timing, others to intensity, others to changes in frequency or patterns over time. It is as if the signal arrives at a busy sorting office, where several specialists immediately begin checking different parts of the same delivery. No one there is yet writing poetry about the sound or reminiscing about childhood, but the brainstem is already doing real computation. It is already deciding what details matter and how they should be organised for the next stages ahead. From there, parts of the signal travel upward into structures in the brainstem that are especially important for locating sound. This is where hearing becomes spatial in a more deliberate way. The ears are on opposite sides of the head, which means sound from one side usually reaches one ear slightly earlier and slightly louder than the other. The brain uses those tiny differences to determine direction. And when I say tiny, I mean very tiny. Differences in arrival time can be measured in microseconds, which is such a ridiculous amount of precision that it almost sounds rude to mention it casually, and yet the auditory system handles it. It compares timing and loudness between the two ears with astonishing accuracy. For low-frequency sounds, timing differences are especially useful. The wave reaches one ear first, then the other, and neurons in certain brainstem nuclei compare those delays. For higher frequency sounds, the head blocks more of the signal from reaching the far ear, so differences in intensity become more useful. The nearer ear gets a stronger version. The farther ear gets a slightly weakened one. The brain combines these clues with the spectral shaping created by the pinna, those subtle frequency changes caused by the outer ear's folds, and from all of this it constructs a sense of where a sound came from. That is how you can hear a phone buzzing to your left, a bird above you, or a voice from behind you before you have consciously thought about any of it. The system is fast because it has to be. Location matters. It matters for conversation, attention, orientation, and survival. In everyday life, it lets you turn toward the person speaking, follow a sound across a room, and notice when something is approaching from an important direction. In less everyday life, it stops you from stepping absent-mindedly into trouble while staring at a bakery window. The auditory brain is constantly building a map of sound in space, and it does so using differences so small that no conscious mind could ever compute them manually. This spatial work continues through the inferior colliculus in the midbrain, a major hub for auditory processing. The inferior colliculus collects and integrates information from earlier brainstem centers, helping refine sound localization and organize more complex auditory patterns. By this point, sound is no longer just being represented as pitch and loudness. It is being arranged in relation to time, direction, and context. The brain is building a usable acoustic scene. It is deciding not only what frequencies are present, but where they are, when they changed, whether they began suddenly, whether they moved, and whether they deserve attention. That last part matters more than we often realize. Hearing is not a simple open door through which every sound enters equally. The brain is selective. It cannot give full importance to everything at once, and frankly, it would be exhausting if it tried. In a cafe, you may hear the general murmur of many voices, clinking cups, footsteps, distant music, and the espresso machine behaving with great self-importance. Yet you can often focus on the voice across from you and let the rest blur into background. This ability is sometimes called auditory scene analysis. The brain groups sound sources, separates them, tracks them over time, and decides which stream of sound belongs together. This is not trivial. The acoustic world is messy. Multiple sound waves mix together before they ever reach the ear. There is no physical line in the air separating one speaker from another. The ear receives a combined pattern, and the brain must untangle it. It uses pitch, timing, rhythm, spatial cues, onset and offset, and learned expectations to decide what belongs with what. That is how a melody stands out from accompaniment, how one person's speech emerges from a crowd, and how you can recognize a glass breaking as one event rather than a meaningless burst of frequencies. The world arrives blended. The brain sorts it. Speech is perhaps the most impressive example of this sorting, because understanding language requires a great deal more than just hearing sound. The auditory system must detect rapid changes, preserve consonants, track vowels, notice stress, rhythm, pauses, and transitions, and do all of it quickly enough that meaning unfolds in real time. Speech sounds overlap one another. Words not usually spoken as neat acoustic blocks with polite silence in between. They run together, change shape depending on surrounding sounds, and vary wildly from speaker to speaker. Yet the brain usually handles this with surprising ease. Part of that ease comes from specialized regions of the auditory cortex, located mainly in the temporal lobes. The primary auditory cortex receives organized input that still preserves the frequency map begun in the cochlea. High and low frequencies are represented in a systematic pattern, but surrounding auditory areas go farther. They begin detecting more complex features, combinations of frequencies, timing relationships, and the patterns that matter for speech and other meaningful sounds. As processing spreads through these networks, the brain starts answering increasingly sophisticated questions. Is this speech or not speech? Is it familiar or unfamiliar? Is it a voice or a machine? Is it emotionally neutral or urgent? Is it directed at me? Does it match a word I know? One of the loveliest things about this is that the brain does not hear voices merely as sound sources. It hears them as identities. Most people can recognize familiar voices almost instantly, sometimes from a single word or even from the way someone clears their throat before speaking. That recognition depends on patterns in pitch, tone, resonance, rhythm, accent, and countless small features shaped by the person's vocal tract and speaking habits. The ear delivers the acoustic details. The brain says, "That is my mother, that is my friend, that is the actor from that series, that is the neighbour who always sounds as though he is slightly disappointed by the weather." There are regions in the temporal lobe especially involved in voice processing, helping the brain treat human vocal sound as a special category. This makes sense. Voices matter deeply in human life. They carry language, yes, but also identity, emotion, intention, age, health, and social meaning. A single sentence can sound affectionate, impatient, frightened, bored, amused, or exhausted without changing its words at all. The brain is exquisitely tuned to these differences. It does not only decode what was said, it decodes how it was said, and often who said it, almost simultaneously. Meaning itself draws in even broader networks. Once speech is recognized as speech, language areas become involved in linking sound patterns to words, grammar, memory, and understanding. The brain must compare incoming sound to stored knowledge. It must segment the stream, identify likely words, resolve ambiguity, and fit those words into context. This happens so quickly in fluent listening that it feels effortless, but it is not effortless at all. It is dense, rapid neural coordination. You hear a sentence, and within fractions of a second the brain has mapped sound to language, language to meaning, and meaning to relevance. Hearing by then has become thought. Music reveals another side of this process. A melody is not just a sequence of pitches, it is pattern, expectation, timing, memory, and often emotion. The brain tracks intervals, rhythm, contour, harmony, repetition, and surprise. It predicts what might come next, notices when expectations are met or violated, and often links these patterns to feeling. This is why music can feel moving in a way that simple sound is not. The auditory system is not just registering frequencies, it is detecting structured relationships across time. The brain hears a melody as something unfolding, not as isolated notes stacked end to end like laundry on a line. Memory is woven through all of this. A sound is often meaningful because of what it has meant before. The chime of a message tone, the creak of a particular floorboard, the start-up sound of an old computer, a parent's voice calling from another room, the clatter of dishes in a childhood kitchen. These are not just acoustically recognizable, they are memory-laden. Auditory cortex interacts with memory systems so that hearing becomes tied to personal history. That is why a sound can transport a person so suddenly. It is not that the ear has become sentimental, it is that the brain has matched a present signal to an older pattern and opened a door. Emotion enters with equal force. Certain sounds calm us, others alarm us immediately. A baby crying, glass shattering, a harsh shout, a soothing tone of voice, thunder in the distance, applause, laughter. The auditory system links with emotional centers so that sounds acquire value. Some demand action. Some invite rest. Some signal safety. Some carry discomfort before thought has even fully caught up. This is useful. A slow, deliberate analysis of a scream would not be an ideal survival strategy. The brain is allowed to react quickly when the acoustic pattern suggests urgency. At the same time, context can change everything. The same loud bang may be harmless fireworks on one evening, and deeply startling if heard unexpectedly in a quiet house. The same words may sound comforting in one voice and threatening in another. The same melody may feel pleasant on one day and almost unbearable on another because of memory or mood. Hearing is therefore never just the passive arrival of acoustic information. It is interpretation shaped by attention, memory, expectation, and emotional state. Attention deserves a special mention because it changes what the brain allows to matter. You're probably aware, at least faintly, of many more sounds than you consciously notice. The brain filters aggressively. It suppresses repetition that seems unimportant. It highlights novelty. It can tune into one voice and let another fade. It can make a ticking clock disappear for hours, and then suddenly notice it when the room grows quiet. This does not mean the ear stopped working and restarted for dramatic effect. It means the brain's priorities shifted. That selectivity is one reason hearing feels both rich and manageable. If every sound arrived at equal importance, life would be unbearable. Imagine noticing with identical intensity the fridge hum, the blood in your ears, distant traffic, clothing against fabric, your own breathing, the room's faint electrical buzz, and every footstep outside all at once for the entire day. The brain prevents this by making choices, most of them below awareness. Some sounds are grouped as background, others move into the foreground, some are tagged as relevant because of meaning. Your name in a crowded room is a classic example. Somehow, through noise and distraction, the brain often notices it anyway. That is not magic. It is priority. This ability depends partly on top-down influence, meaning the brain does not just receive sound from the ears, it also sends signals back, shaping how auditory information is processed. Expectation, focus, and learning alter hearing. A musician may notice harmonies others miss. A parent may wake instantly to one child's cry while sleeping through thunderously unhelpful snoring beside them. Someone learning a new language may hear a blur at first, then with time begin noticing distinctions that used to vanish into noise. The auditory brain is plastic. It learns, it adapts, it gets better at hearing what experience has taught it to hear. Direction, meaning, voice, and memory all come together in ordinary moments so seamlessly that we almost never stop to admire the completed act. Someone says your name from across a room. The ears detect the sound. The brain locates the direction. It identifies the voice. It recognizes the language. It understands the meaning. It estimates the tone. It decides whether this is urgent, affectionate, or merely someone asking where the scissors have gone again. All of that can happen in a blink. What feels like simple hearing is actually layered interpretation, and this is why damage to different parts of the auditory system can create such different experiences. A person may have perfectly healthy ears but trouble understanding language after certain brain injuries. Another may detect sound but struggle to localize it. Someone else may hear speech as noise in crowded rooms because timing or separation is impaired higher up the pathway. The act of hearing is distributed. The ear begins it. The brain completes it. There is even a lovely humility in that fact. The brain does not invent sound from nothing, and the ear does not understand what it detects. Each needs the other. The cochlea provides an exquisitely structured report. The auditory nerve delivers it. The brainstem compares and organizes. The cortex interprets and connects. Memory and emotion add weight. Attention adds priority. Only then does the heard world become the meaningful world. By now it becomes easier to understand the title of this final part. The brain hears last not because it is late to the task, but because hearing is only finished when the brain has made something of the signal. Until then, there are waves, vibrations, spikes, and patterns. After that, there is a voice in the dark, a warning from the street, a joke landing properly, a song returning after many years, the direction of footsteps in the hall, the difference between wind and whisper, the unmistakable sound of someone you love entering the room. And even now, while you're listening, this whole system is still at work without asking anything of you. Your ears are receiving, your brain is sorting. It is placing this voice somewhere in space, identifying its tone, smoothing its rhythm into language, attaching meaning to each sentence, and quietly discarding countless other sounds that matter less. Somewhere beneath awareness, old circuits of memory and prediction are helping the process along. The hidden machinery of hearing is carrying on its patient work just as it always has, turning motion into signal and signal into something human, until the world around you no longer arrives as vibration alone, but as presence, pattern, and the gentle sense of being here to hear it.